Chapter 497. Frost Lich, Let the World Freeze, Frost Explosion. Despite the ominous feeling in his heart, Geoffrey could not stop no matter what. He gripped the magic card of the Frost Scepter tightly as he stared coldly at the arena below. The Frost Lich, with the Frost Staff, was surrounded by a circle of glowing icicles. It was the Underworld Ice Ring that came with the Underworld Ice Ring when it broke out of the Underworld Ice Coffin. With the Underworld Ice Ring as support, the Frost Lich's ice and ghost element skills would be greatly enhanced, and the Frost Scepter in its hand could increase the effect of its ice element skills. With the two added together, the Frost Lich's ice element skills would be doubled in strength and effect. After hearing Geoffrey's command, the Frost Lich suddenly raised the scepter up high. The icy blue ripples suddenly turned into a raging wave, surging forward like a surging tide. Ultimate skill: Frost Explosion. Card name: Frost Lich. Memorize in 1 second. https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP type: Elf card. Level: Race: Undying. Attribute: Spectre/Ice. Magic power: 3500. Attack: 2500. Defense: 2000. Ultimate skills: Frost Explosion, Frost Magic Shield, Sinister Gaze. Starting from the tip of the Frost Lich's toes, the places where the tide surged past instantly froze. Layers of ice spread wildly. Compared to the Desert Ice Spirit's Freezing Ray, the Frost Lich's Frost Explosion had a larger range and stronger effect. Facing such a large range ice attack that had no blind spots, even if Boss Cat used guard again, it would not be able to successfully block it. Moreover, its success rate was only 1 out of 9. After its first attempt failed, Boss Cat knew that it could no longer avoid it. It suddenly lowered its body and used its tail to wrap around the blue magic ball and threw it into the sky. The young green-eyed dragon that was restrained by the ice element grabbed the blue magic ball and flew up. The scabbard hesitated for a moment and also chose to fly into the sky to avoid it. Only Boss Cat and Moon Ivan were left on the ground. Moon Ivan's eyes flashed with viciousness. He suddenly opened his mouth, and the shadow ball condensed in his mouth shot out. However, the powerful shadow sphere was instantly swallowed by the raging waves of ice. A hint of unwillingness flashed in its eyes, but it still couldn't escape the fate of being frozen. The countdown timer for the first round of battle quickly passed. When Frost Eruption stopped, the entire dueling ground was covered in a thick layer of frozen earth. Boss Cat and Moon Ibu couldn't resist the freeze effect and became two motionless ice sculptures. After being sealed in ice, the mana of the two magic elves began to plummet at a rate visible to the naked eye. It wouldn't take long for their magic power to be exhausted, and their vital signs would disappear. Even though two of the Dake Diming's magic guide fairies managed to escape into the air, the entire situation had changed drastically. As a fourth-year student, Angus Geoffrey finally managed to turn the tables. The group of nobles led by him secretly heaved a sigh of relief. If Geoffrey had lost to Dake Diming here, then not only would Geoffrey lose face, these companions who usually hung out with him would also lose face. Like I said, how could Angus lose to a first-year student? The nobles patted each other's shoulders, their expressions somewhat relaxed. Looks like Geoffrey didn't just focus on forming his own faction in the academy, Phyllis also pondered. Currently, Geoffrey had a 7-star magic guide fairy, Frost Lich. On the other hand, Doc only had a 6-star magic guide fairy and a 4-star magic guide fairy whose attributes were countered by Dark. No matter how one looked at it, Geoffrey had the advantage. How could Dake turn the tables in this situation? Eldest Prince Charles couldn't help but be attracted by the duel in the secret box, but his gaze was still fixed on the scabbard. Dake himself didn't seem the least bit nervous. The Frost Lich's strength was within his expectations. He had already mentally prepared himself to make some sacrifices. The only unexpected thing was that Boss Cat and Moon Ibu's HP dropped too quickly. After being sealed in ice, the two magic guide fairies' MP dropped at a crazy rate of over 100 points. Boss Cat's MP was a full 2,500 points. Even though it had used up some of its MP when using a sure kill skill, it could still last until the next round. As for Moon Ibu, it was very likely that it wouldn't last. Once the MP of a magic guide fairy dropped below 50%, it was very easy for the summoning to fail when using it as a sacrifice. Now, it was impossible to use Moon Ibu as a sacrifice to summon the 4-star Diru beasts. And if he wanted to use Boss Cat as a sacrifice, Dake's only 5-star magic guide fairy, the lion beast, wasn't in his hands. Therefore, the best method now was to leave it alone. Dake's eyes flashed. He stretched out his hand and pointed, controlling the blue magic guide ball to fly back. He then said to Sin, "It's time, sword." Sin. Cyanide young dragon's eyebrows flashed with a hint of madness. It stretched out its hand and grabbed at the air. When the single sword scabbard heard the order, it immediately, weapon transformation, and flew straight towards it. It then closed its 5 fingers and grabbed the hilt of the single sword scabbard. Suddenly, a strong force rushed out from the single sword scabbard and circulated around its limbs and bones. Then, Sin. Cyanide young dragon's attack went straight up into the sky. As a 6-star magic guide fairy, Sin, young green-eyed dragon, could obtain a total of 1,800 points of attack power. Its final attack power was 4,800 points, obviously far exceeding that of the Frost Lich. Under such a huge difference in attack power, elemental suppression seemed insignificant. Of course, the Frost Lich was obviously not good at attacking. Underworld Ice Ring and Frost Scepter's buffs were also on the level of spells. But according to normal logic, a sure kill skill like Frost Explosion definitely couldn't be released continuously. Therefore, Dake made a prompt decision and commanded Sin, Cyanide young dragon, to take advantage of this gap to charge towards the Frost Lich. The cyanide young dragon that was born from Pride was already impatient. Now that it received the buffs from the Holy Sword, it naturally couldn't hold it anymore and charged towards the Frost Lich that was emitting cold air. The closer it was to the ground, the lower the temperature. The elemental suppression made Sin, Cyanide young dragon, very uncomfortable, but the existence of the world of Sin gave it a boost. Sin. Cyanide young dragon rode the wind and used its dragon claws to hold the sword, fiercely stabbing towards the Frost Lich. But in the face of such an obvious attack, the Frost Lich didn't need the command of the Archmage. It tilted its scepter and activated its second sure kill skill, Frost Magic Shield. The magic released from the orb at the tip of the Frost Scepter formed an octagonal ice shield around it. Then, the 8 ice shields rapidly expanded. There was a connection between the shield and the shield, forming a complete ring-shaped defense. Even the places where the ice shield couldn't cover had a defensive force field. Bang! Sin. Cyanide young dragon's sword fiercely smashed onto the ice shield. But in the face of this attack of 4,800 points, the ice shield was actually undamaged. It only shook a little and the impact was dissipated. Seeing this, Angus Jeffrey, who just raised his spirits, suddenly relaxed. He sneered and said, "Frost Lich, now's the time. Frost Explosion." In an instant, the gem of the Frost Scepter once again burst out a terrifying icy blue wave. No one would have thought that the Frost Lich would actually use Frost Explosion for the second time without any interval. Is it the effect of the aura from breaking out of the coffin or the special effect of the Frost Scepter? A guess flashed through Dake's mind, but he remained calm and quickly gave an unbelievable order. Cyan Smoke young dragon, protect the sword. Protect the sword? Protect what sword? While the onlookers were shocked, Sin, Cyanide young dragon, completely understood his order and quickly carried it out. When Sin, Cyanide young dragon scales were touched by Frost Explosion, it suddenly turned its body and used its huge body to block the waves for a moment. Then, it suddenly threw its sword and threw single scabbard into the sky. Using this acceleration, the single scabbard flashed past the eyes of the people in the corridor and rushed into the sky. And this time, the Frost Explosion that was released in an inclined direction continued to move forward after completely freezing Sin, Cyanide young dragon, forming a wave of ice crystals that looked like the solidification of the tide. So, the only blue cube magic elf that could still move on the field was the single scabbard. That was a sword but not a sword. Tick. In the extremely quiet scene caused by the 2 consecutive frost explosion, the 30-second countdown of the 4th round was about to end. Battle stage 5:30s. A new countdown appeared on the projection. Both players drew their cards at the same time. Although Angus Jeffrey thought that the outcome was already decided, he still didn't forget to draw his cards. It was just that in the process of drawing his cards, his voice that had completely calmed down didn't stop. Frost Lich, use Frost Magic Bullet to attack the blue cube magic ball. So, from the Frost Scepter, Frost Magic Bullet, after Frost Magic Bullet, was condensed. Each Frost Magic Bullet was the size of a human's head, and there was no gap when it was condensed. It was equivalent to a normal attack. Although the power wasn't high, the advantage was that it was continuous and didn't consume much. This was the sure kill skill that came with the Frost Scepter. The Frost Lich shook its finger, and the Frost Magic Bullet shot towards the blue cube magic ball in the air at an extremely fast speed. Jeffrey, who had regained control of the situation, started to turn from defense to offense. The Frost Magic Shield was still surrounding the Frost Lich, and the Frost Magic Bullet shot out continuously like a machine gun. Dake was surprised, but he didn't hesitate to pour all his effort into controlling the magic ball. He still had the magic ring that Professor Ka-Zayer gave him for Christmas on his finger. It was a practical tool that helped him master long-distance magic conduction. And that ability was fully displayed at this time. Although there was a slight risk, the blue cube magic ball perfectly dodged the Frost Magic Bullet under his control. His face was calm, and his fingertips quickly moved the magic ball horizontally. Angus Jeffrey saw him like this, but he sneered in his heart, pretending to be calm. After whispering, he suddenly raised his hand. He didn't continue to summon new magic spirits, but he also released his magic power into the blue cube magic ball. It was like a long rope that pulled the blue cube magic ball, making it extremely difficult for Dake to control it. The long-distance control of the magic ball by a magus was affected by the quality and quantity of magic power, and on the other hand, it was affected by the distance. In other words, the closer the distance, the stronger the control. The blue cube magic ball had already been pulled to the blue half by Dake, so his control was naturally stronger than Jeffrey's. However, Jeffrey's interference still made the magic ball seem like it was covered with a layer of disgusting mucus, and its speed suddenly slowed down. In this way, Dake had even less energy to summon new magic cards. As long as he made a mistake, Jeffrey would be able to take this duel. From an outsider's point of view, Dake's only way to break out of this situation was the single scabbard. However, Sin, Blue-Eyed Baby Dragon, couldn't break through the Frost Magic Shield's defense even with the single scabbard. How could the sword do it alone? Once it was frozen, it would be difficult for the sword to escape. The victory of this duel seemed to be in Jeffrey's hands. After all, it's a 4th year versus a 1st year. For a 1st-year student to be able to do this in a duel with a 4th year, it's already very outstanding. I really didn't expect the son of the Valkyrie to become so outstanding after entering the Shang Malian Academy. I thought he would be a prodigal. Sure, be careful of the walls. Just when everyone thought that Dake Dimming would definitely lose, Moon Ibu, who had lasted longer than expected, finally used up the last drop of magic power in the ice. Then, at the place where his body dissipated into magic power, there was a pink aura that overflowed and condensed into a palm-sized whirlpool. That whirlpool went from its initial inconspicuous size to a huge one, and it only took 3 seconds. A brand new magic guide sprite was conjured from within. What is this? Angus Jeffrey's eyes were filled with astonishment, and he couldn't help but stop the magic transmission in his hands. Dake Dimming clearly didn't have any summoning actions, and the magic card in his hands didn't have any movement. Just as Jeffrey looked over in astonishment, he suddenly noticed that a magic card had automatically floated out from the card slot of the deck. This was the mechanism to directly summon a magic elf from the deck. Could it be? Jeffrey's gaze finally noticed the dark golden radiance that he had almost overlooked. The green-eyed young dragon had used Hall of Light, and World of Sin, but apart from Frigid Earth, which was used to disperse it, it didn't display the effects of a field skill at all. If he had to find a reasonable explanation, he could only classify it as the effect of this field skill. Jeffrey's brain was working at high speed, quickly searching for field skills or field cards that had similar effects. Generally speaking, unless it was a veteran duelist who specially made exclusive magic cards for duels, a magister wouldn't deliberately make magic cards that could search from the deck, or directly summon a magic elf from the deck. For example, Jeffrey's own Underworld Ice Coffin was made based on a monster of the same name. Its core idea was to directly summon a high-star magic elf, and through breaking out of the coffin, it would add an extremely powerful buff halo to the magic elf. And the so-called summon directly from the deck was just an additional ability that came with it. World of Sin, Green-Eyed Dragon's World of Sin, was actually similar. Their main characteristic was that there was no need to inject magic into the summoning magic card, and through a special mechanism, the summoning magic card would respond. Therefore, there was no need to put it into the hand. However, field skills or field cards like World of Sin were still extremely rare. Moreover, Jeffrey couldn't distinguish the similarities between Moon Ibu and the newly appeared magic elf, Big Milk Can, so he couldn't immediately figure out the effects of World of Sin. After that, there was no more time. Big Milk Can roll. While controlling the magic ball, Dake commanded without hesitation. Big Milk Can, who hadn't appeared in a duel for a long time, spontaneously used turn round before rolling. After curling up into a ball, it didn't hesitate to roll in this frosty arena. Seeing the speed of Big Milk can gradually increase, Dake couldn't help but smirk. He really wanted to know if Jeffrey would let the Frost Lich change its target to Big Milk Can. If it changed its target, it would give him 3 seconds to use a new magic card. But if it didn't change its target, Magic Frost Shield didn't seem to have much damage at the moment. Without a doubt, it was Big Milk Can's favorite target. Bang! As the distance wasn't far, Big Milk can quickly hit the Magic Frost Shield. The surface of its body was stained with a layer of frost, but it didn't suffer much from the recoil. Relying on the 3,000 points of defense after using Turn Round, Big Milk can retreat it unscathed. Even the frost on the surface of its body was dispelled during the rolling process. With its only 1,000 points of attack, plus the 60 points of damage after Turn Round, it didn't cause any damage to the Magic Frost Shield. For a 7-star Frost Lich, this was probably just a massaging attack. As expected, Angus Jeffrey didn't order the Frost Lich to change its target because of this weak rolling. He attached great importance to the strategy of relying on the Frost Lich to stall Dake. But he didn't underestimate Big Milk Can. Therefore, he glanced at the magic card in his hand and immediately started summoning. The new Magic Guide cards were 2 3-star Magic Guide Elf cards. In Jeffrey's card deck, the basic 3-star Magic Elf cards and the high-level 6-star Magic Elf cards were the main cards. There were also 1-star and 2-star Magic Elf cards, but there were very few of them. After that, there were 3 7-star Magic Elf cards and 1 8-star Magic Elf card. This was a relatively basic composition in the 4th-year card deck. If there were too many high-level Magic Elf cards that couldn't be specially summoned, it would be a hindrance in the Magic Elf duel. For the excellent students who had a shorter casting time of the sacrificial summoning spell, the sacrificial summoning speed was actually not too slow. However, the restriction of summoning a Magic Elf of the NTH tier required at least 1 Magic Elf of the NTH tier as a sacrifice, which made it more troublesome to use the sacrificial summoning of 3rd tier and above Magic Elves. Therefore, for the 4th-year students who didn't have many 3rd tier Magic Elf cards, the 6-star Magic Elf that could be summoned at once was still the backbone of the team. Jeffrey quickly summoned a 3-star Magic Guide Fairy, and prepared to summon a second one. Then, he would wait for the next round. If he still couldn't take down Dake, he would summon the new 6-star Magic Elf. It could only be said that his idea wasn't wrong. Moreover, the first 3-star Magic Elf that he summoned had the ability to fly and could cooperate with the Frost Lich to attack the Blue Cube Magic Elf Ball. It could be said that the appearance of this 3-star Magic Elf would increase the pressure on Dake. However, when this 3-star Magic Elf appeared, Geoffrey suddenly realized that Dake Diming's other magic elf, Boss Cat, had also died from exhaustion in the ice. This should have been something to be happy about. However, when Geoffrey saw the pink cow that was turning its head and rolling towards the Frost Lich for the second time, the faint ominous feeling in his heart suddenly became stronger. Then, 3 seconds later, at the place where Boss Cat disappeared, no new magic elf appeared. There was a gap in Dake Diming's Greed magic elf. Other than Meow Meow, only Single Scabbard could be considered the incarnation of Greed. And Single Scabbard was hovering in the air, looking for an opportunity. Naturally, there was no new Greed magic elf to summon. Fly, Ice Vulture. Geoffrey's expression had an additional, I knew it, calmness. That 3-star magic elf, Ice Vulture, flapped its wings and flew after a long cry. Its long beak was like a sword and its wings were folded into a triangular shape. It charged towards the blue cube magic elf ball with the lowest air resistance. Dake indeed felt the pressure. Hence, he moved his finger and immediately controlled the blue cube magic elf ball to fly downwards. In theory, the space in the air was wider, but there were more ice blocks on the ground as obstacles to block the surprise attack of the magic bullet and Ice Vulture. Moreover, the statue of Sin, Cyanide Young Dragon, was also there. Before Sin, Cyanide Young Dragon, was frozen, it had already taken the attack of Icicle Spear Formation head-on, so its magic was already full. Hence, when Dake controlled the blue cube magic elf ball to fly behind it, Geoffrey summoned the second 3-star magic elf, and when Big Milk can hit Frost Magic Shield for the second time and retreated unscathed, Sin, Cyanide Young Dragon, finally retreated. However, at the place where it disappeared, Pride's aura remained and turned into a cyclone. A magic elf that was not higher than Sin, Cyanide Young Dragon star level was directly summoned by relying on Sin World as field effect. Sin World, Sin, Cyanide Young Dragon can summon Sin World. When a magic elf with the power of Original Sin dies in Sin World, the remaining power of Original Sin will be absorbed by Sin World. It can be used as a sacrifice to summon a magic elf that is not higher than the dead one and has the same power of Original Sin. The duration of Sin World is 3 minutes. As a magic elf with the highest star level below, Cyanide Young Dragon, Lion Beast, quietly appeared in a kneeling posture. Seeing that the Frost Magic Bullet that was chasing after the blue cube magic ball was attacking from the front, the Lion Beast frowned and stood up. Its huge fist suddenly swung out, Beast King Fist. Boom! The lion's strong energy wave released from the Lion Beast's right fist exploded all the Frost Magic Bullet that were attacking it in succession. Then, it raised its hand and focused its eyes. It had a telepathic connection with the Single Scabbard that was hovering in the air. Clang! Although it was not as strong as the Delu Beast, the Single Scabbard and the Lion Beast still had a bond. With a shake of the sword, it whizzed down from above and landed in the Lion Beast's palm. The Lion Beast suddenly pulled out its sword. It's here. Eldest Prince Charles, who was in the secret room, suddenly focused his attention on the Lion Beast in the field. Although Charles knew a lot of core secrets related to a hero, because he had only met Hero Brett once when he was young, he did not have a clear understanding of Hero's power. Therefore, the most direct experience he had of Hero's power was from the Lion Beast and the Delu Beast. For Hero, this kind of savior who carried a heavy destiny, Charles had a reverence and longing that was passed down from childhood. It was a thought that had nothing to do with his background and position. It was a thought that was rooted in the depths of his heart. He let Geoffrey and Dake duel to lure out the hero's power of the Delu Beast or the Lion Beast. Although the core purpose was to observe and confirm, he also wanted to take a look at it again. Humans were the most complicated creatures. When the Lion Beast unsheathed its sword, although its attack bonus was not as strong as Sin, Young Green-Eyed Dragon, its aura was one and it gave off a completely different feeling when Sin, Young Green-Eyed Dragon, was wielding its sword. That was a difference that could not be shown on the surface. Angus Geoffrey, who had seen this scene during the Easter Duel Festival, finally could not maintain the initial strategy. He quickly stopped the leaving Yuan Ice Vulture from recklessly diving down and ordered the Frost Lich to temporarily give up on the magic conducting ball and focus on killing the lion beast. The beautiful and expressionless Frost Lich turned the Frost Scepter, without a trace of emotion, and launched a sure kill skill at the lion beast that was holding its sword, Evil Gaze. Instantly, a cold and evil light lit up from the Lich's eyes. Two extremely faint beams of light suddenly shot out, hitting the charging lion beast head-on. The lion beast's body froze. It was actually frozen in place, and its legs could not move no matter how hard it tried. Then, it suddenly felt a suction force, and the magic power in its body was constantly being sucked away. The Frost Lich greedily absorbed the lion beast's magic power and gradually filled up the magic power that it had consumed. Bang! Suddenly, a loud sound was heard. The Frost Lich's body trembled and its expression changed slightly. The power of the third, rolling, finally showed some signs. Although the Frost magic shield was not damaged at all, whether it was Jeffrey or the other onlookers, they all sensed that something was wrong. However, Evil Gaze was a single-target sure-kill skill. While using its gaze to stare at the lion beast, the Frost Lich was also unable to move. Once it stopped staring, the lion beast would break free from its control and pounce over. Jeffrey, who knew clearly how shocking the lion beast's outburst would be, chose to order it to continue staring. Then, he ordered his other 2 3-star magic elves to attack the big milk can. However, the big milk can, which had already hit 3 times, was already showing its power. As it rolled, a violent airflow surrounded its body. The sure-kill skill of the Ice Vulture, Ice Arrow, was shattered by the airflow just as it was about to hit. The other 3-star magic elf, the Ice Statue of Li Yuan, also used a rolling method to crash into the big milk can from the front, trying to force it to stop. However, the big milk can nimbly tilted to the right and dodged the Ice Statue of Li Yuan, continuing to roll towards the Frost Lich in an arc. Clearly, its driving skills were far better than the Ice Statue of Li Yuan. Immediately after, the fourth, rolling, fiercely collided with the Frost Magic Shield. The resulting loud sound covered the sound of the turn switch. Although the Frost Magic Shield was still standing, the rolling, this time caused it to tremble non-stop. Then, the big milk can's rolling was unstoppable. Just the violent airflow that wrapped around its body made Jeffrey's expression change drastically. He hurriedly ordered the 2 3-star magic elves that were still chasing after it to dodge. Then, when he finally realized why Dake Diming's eyes were teasing him previously, Jeffrey's fingers trembled slightly as he took out 2 new magic cards from the deck. Battle Stage 6. 30s. However, when Jeffrey looked up slightly after taking out the cards, he suddenly realized that there were 4 magic cards quietly covering Dake's card table. He actually didn't even look at the 2 rounds of magic cards that were played consecutively. Jeffrey's eyebrows suddenly twitched, and there was a sudden surge of anger in his heart. He hurriedly pressed his chest and tried to calm himself down. The duel was still ongoing. As long as he won, he could make Dake pay the price for his arrogance. The anger gave him stimulation, and he was unprecedentedly focused. Among the 2 new magic cards, one was a 6-star magic elf card, and the other was a secret ritual card. Die! Jeffrey abruptly put the 6-star magic elven card aside and picked up the secret ritual card. Then, he quickly opened the secret ritual card, and a layer of undetectable fluctuation appeared on the Frost Lich's body. Only then did he pick up the 6-star magic elf card again, waiting for the cooldown time to perform the sacrificial summoning. On the field, the big milk can had already rolled towards the Frost Lich for the 5th time. 4-in-1 8,000 plus. 6-1 requesting votes. 0109/233, May target. 240,000, completed, 220,000 words. June, what target should we set? Brothers, give me your opinions. Yen 180, 000, 240,000 yen. Yen 300, 000. Chapter 498. Frost Demonic Shield. The Frost Lich releases its magic to create 8 Frost Demonic Shields that are connected to the Frost Lich's body. The Frost Lich's defense is increased by 25% and the damage received during battle is reduced by 25%. Relying on Underworld Ice Ring and Frost Scepter, the damage reduction of Demonic Frost Shield was increased by 50%. The defense of Frost Lich was also increased by 50%, which was a total of 3,000 defense. It was because of the damage reduction effect of Demonic Frost Shield that the Frost Lich was able to withstand Sin Young Green-Eye Dragoness Sword and Big Milk Can's fourth roll. However, when faced with the fifth roll of the Big Milk Can, even the indestructible Demonic Frost Shield couldn't withstand it anymore. Boom! When the Big Milk Can hit the Demonic Frost Shield, the loud sound was like thunder, causing the nobles who were watching from above to be shocked. The Demonic Frost Shield that had 50% damage reduction actually had dense and horrifying cracks in an instant. The Frost Lich that was using Sinister Gaze with all its might suddenly trembled. The cold and evil light in its eyes shook crazily, and the orb on the Frost Scepter constantly emitted circles of icy blue ripples. However, the damage of the Big Milk Can's roll had exceeded 10,000 points. Even with the 50% damage reduction, the Demonic Frost Shield was instantly shattered. Website https://m Vipkanshu. VIP. It brought along a violent storm as it crashed into the broken pieces of the Demonic Frost Shield. Relying on its last remaining inertia, it crashed into the side of the Frost Lich with a bang. The Frost Lich let out an ear-piercing scream. The light in its eyes instantly shattered, and its entire pale and enchanting body flew out like a kite with a broken string. Without the Demonic Frost Shield as support, it only had 2,000 points of defense left. Even the last bit of the Big Milk can't withstand the Demonic Frost Shield. The magic that it absorbed from the Lion Beast instantly decreased, and when it fell again, it only had a sliver of health left. The Lion Beast that finally broke free from the Demonic Frost Lich's control suddenly rushed out with lightning speed. With a flash of cold light, the sword drew a straight line in the air and slashed across the Frost Lich's delicate neck. As the magic power splashed, the Frost Lich's body started to fade at a speed visible to the naked eye. Seeing that this 7-star magic elf was about to leave, Angus Jeffrey's eyes flashed with a trace of ruthlessness. Sacrificial summoning was already in the midst of chanting. The secret instrument card on the table shone with a dim light. The secret ritual that was placed on the Frost Lich finally took effect when its body was disintegrating. The collapsed mana of the Frost Lich suddenly condensed into a tiny vortex. Then, the vortex instantly exploded, and a huge magic array unfolded on the ground. The Frost Scepter that was still floating in the air naturally became the core of the magic circle. A faint sound was heard. It quickly went from a low hum to a high pitch, and finally became extremely ear-piercing. The Lion Beast at the side was surprised, and without hesitation, he swung his sword and slashed back. As he rotated his wrist, sword lights shot out like rain, and every strike hit the Frost Scepter, floating in the air. With the strength of the Frost Scepter, there was no doubt that it would be shattered on the spot. But the magic circle below didn't stop operating. The light that erupted from the magic circle flashed frequently, and it was getting more and more dangerous. Facing this sudden burst of terrifying aura, the Milk Can rubbed its hands and rubbed out a bottle of milk. Then, it threw the milk at the Lion Beast. Moo! The Lion Beast caught the milk and was about to drink it when it opened the bottle cap. But the explosion had already occurred. It was a huge explosion that affected the entire field. The Lion Beast didn't have much mana left, and it instantly ran out. The Milk Can turned around and hugged the blue magic ball, using its broad back to resist the impact of the explosion. The scabbard soared into the sky from the explosion, and it was out of danger again. Jeffrey's Ice Vulture flew high in the sky, protecting the red magic ball. The Ice Statue of Departure sat on the ground and used its sure kill skill, Gargoyle. Like a gargoyle, it turned into an ice statue and relied on the damage reduction effect to hold on. When the explosion was over, on the ground, only the Milk Can and the Ice Statue of Departure, whose surface was covered with cracks, were left. Immediately after, there was no gap at all. Geoffrey's summoning conclusion was heard. In the name of Angus Geoffrey, I sacrifice to summon the giant glacier ape. The ice statue of departure, and ice vulture, instantly turned into light and merged with the light released from the 6-star magic elf card to form a huge sacrificial summoning circle. The magic elf that appeared from the sacrificial summoning circle let out an angry roar, and its huge body fell to the ground, causing a tremor. It was like a giant ape that had awakened from the Ice Age. Its body was covered with gray hair, and its mountain-like body bulged with hard muscles. It exerted force with both hands and pounded its chest, making a loud sound that shook the sky. Card name, Giant Glacier Ape. Type, Elf card. Level, Race, Bird/Beast. Attribute, Ice/Normal. Mana, 2500. Attack, 2800. Defense, 2800. Sure kill skills, Death Charge, Ice Roar, Rage, Giant Glacier Ape, Death Charge. Angus Geoffrey raised the glacial giant ape, card up high with a cold expression, and yelled out in a loud voice. The magic elves on the field had all been cleared. Only the milk can and the giant glacier ape were left. The milk can that had used all of its sure kill skills would not be able to stop the giant glacier ape from charging. The flames of victory were already shining in its eyes. However, the dark golden light that extinguished the flames suddenly circled around the place where the lion beast had fallen, and the aura of pride burst forth. The Dilu beast that had inherited the lion beast's will landed lightly in the light of summoning. The single scabbard that had just flown into the air let out an excited clatter, and with its own will, it flew back and went straight into the Dilu beast's palm. The Dilu beast clenched its 5 fingers and grabbed the sword hilt, and a terrifying aura instantly erupted. Its eyes narrowed slightly, and it danced intensely towards the giant glacier ape that had used Death Charge. The airflow that emerged from its feet spiraled upwards, and at the same time, it gathered towards the holy sword in its hand. With every step it took, a new airflow would appear under its feet, and its aura would increase by a bit. By the time it clashed with the giant glacier ape, its aura had already reached its peak. The violent airflow that reached the sky made its petite body look tall and sturdy, and the single scabbard in its hand emitted a sharp aura that could cut through everything. The giant glacier ape that had used Death Charge was not to be outdone. The pitch-black aura that was emitted from its body erupted backwards, and its eyes were dark and deep, and its face was as ferocious as a demon's. However, in the face of such a terrifying giant beast, the Dilu beast did not show any fear. Instead, it showed a trace of excitement. It licked the corner of its mouth and suddenly jumped up. When its body was in the air, the long sword was swung diagonally at an extremely exquisite angle, and in an instant, a cross was formed. The airflow that erupted from the sword extended the blade of the sword to an extremely large extent. The huge cross suddenly exploded. The giant glacier ape had used its true Death Charge, and its huge body crashed into the cross. Its thick skin and flesh melted, and a terrifying cross wound was cut open. The Dilu beast's body passed through this wound, and then it stopped its momentum. The long sword returned to its scabbard, and it landed on the ground. It took a few steps forward to reduce the momentum. It stabilized its steps and turned around to look back. The giant glacier ape's huge body carried the inertia of the Death Charge, and continued to move forward. Then, it fell down without any consciousness. The milk can that was holding the blue magic ball quickly adjusted its position. Boom! It was as if a mountain had collapsed, and the earth shook. The milk can nervously poked its head out from the cross wound of the giant glacier ape. The body of the giant beast that had fallen on the ground gradually turned into magic starlight, and it dissipated in all directions. In the silence that followed, the Dilu beast glanced at the red magic ball in the air and suddenly attacked with its sword. Life barrier, 2801-0. Light and dark radiance shone on the ground. Scattered sword flashes floated in the sky. After a few seconds, the people in the circular hallway suddenly burst into discussions. The nobles who thought that Dark Diamond's duel with Angus Geoffrey to be so intense were already very outstanding. But at this moment, it was as if they wanted to vent all the impulses in their hearts. They shouted like beans pouring out crazily. The originally quiet and elegant hall instantly turned into a noisy downtown. All kinds of voices were heard for a long time. At this moment, Angus Jeffrey, who had played all his cards but still lost, couldn't hold back his expression anymore. His expression was so gloomy that it was terrifying. A few nobles behind him walked up and tried to comfort him. There were also people who only glanced at his back before curiously looking at Dark Diamond opposite him. People were always more fond of the winner. Phyllis Rahman crossed her arms and thought silently. Unlike the Jeffrey family, the Rahman family hadn't made their stance clear yet. As the only daughter of the Rahman family, Phyllis was often worried about standing on the wrong side. At this moment, what she saw from Dake Dimming was the Dimming family's unshakable future. With such an heir and the long-lived Valkyrie, the Dimming family would probably gradually replace the ancient families with deep roots and become the most terrifying pillar of the kingdom. Although these families had power, they were still inferior to the top forces. Therefore, they had to consider a very realistic problem. That was, even if the first princess fell, would the Valkyrie fall? This was also the question that the Rahman family had been thinking about. Similarly, even if the first prince fell, the holy church that supported him wouldn't fall. This made people even more hesitant. Let's wait and see. Father said that the Demon King execution ceremony in the middle of this month might have a far-reaching impact on the future of the holy church. Phyllis couldn't help but squint her eyes. Like everyone else, she looked at the Duke's son. At that moment, Dark Diamond was methodically putting away the magic cards on the table one by one. The girls clustered behind him all had excited expressions. I told you that we would win. Diana looked at Aurora with a smug look on her face. The vampire's daughter and the Phoenix girl held hands and almost danced. Dake took out the magician's secretary from the deck and quickly summoned it. After the magician's secretary appeared, she began to summon the magic spirits one by one. As for Dark, he cast a spell for those magic guide fairies who had worked hard. Amidst a few exclamations, the Delu beast stepped on the single scabbard and flew up from below to Dake's side. How do you feel about this duel? Dake asked casually. The Delu beast shook its head. It wasn't very happy. Although it used sword dance to end the duel, it would have the same effect if it was a lion. It would rather enter the duel during the duel and fight until it was exhausted. It wouldn't kill the opponent without any suspense like this. Dark smiled and agreed, that's pretty much what I feel. Pride +1. Pride +1. Pride +1. On the opposite side. Angus Jeffrey pressed both of his hands on the card table. His head was lowered as he stared at his fingers. In this duel, from the initial confidence to the shaking in the middle, to the end when he regained his confidence, Jeffrey had experienced many psychological journeys. But when he was about to win, he was shocked to find that Dake had placed all 4 magic cards on the table without even looking at them. That kind of contempt was simply humiliating. What he couldn't accept was that after that, the opponent really didn't do anything. He just relied on the previous arrangements to obtain the final victory. It was as if everything in this duel was under the control of Dake Dimming. The feeling of helplessness from being completely controlled was the main reason for Jeffrey's emotional outbursts. Even if all outside factors were excluded. He was also a top student of the Shang Malian Academy. No matter what, he couldn't accept the fact that he was defeated by a first-year student in this way. At this moment, he suddenly looked back and suddenly felt that his small actions in the last school year were so laughable. Until today, his actions were just like a clown's. In the face of true strength, those flies and dogs were just a joke. The reason why the first prince's faction was struggling was because the Valkyrie was on the first princess's side. Bang! Jeffrey slammed the card table and then picked up the magic card on the table. The gloominess on his face faded like a flood. When he looked up again, he had regained the elegance of a noble. Dimming, you win this time. Jeffrey's voice spread through the hall through the loudspeaker. Dake turned to look at him and smiled. Senior, you let me win. 2 in 1 4,000 plus, yesterday. There was an emergency at home yesterday, so I adjusted my schedule. Target 300,000 words this month. Go. Chapter 499. Dake Dimming and Angus Jeffrey did not become estranged because of the outcome of this duel, at least on the surface. After the duel ended, the two returned to their original seats. They chatted and laughed as if they were very familiar with each other, completely acting like good juniors. However, the news of Jeffrey losing to Dake Dimming in the Magus duel had already quietly spread. Those who were observant even caught the details of Dake not using his trump card in the last 2 rounds. Thus, there were even more theories regarding this duel. People always liked dramatic things. Even if they did not pay attention to it, they would be happy to spread it. Perhaps when Jeffrey returned home tonight, he would discover that this news had already reached his father's ears. Inside a secret room, Prince Charles, on the other hand, fell into deep thought after watching the duel. He finally got to see the performance of the Lion Beast and the Diru Beast as he wished. He also had a deeper understanding of the power of the Holy Sword. He remembered the website, Vipcanshu 6, but for some reason, he felt that he had overlooked something. However, what exactly had he overlooked? He couldn't put his finger on it. This made him gradually feel irritated. It was the same irritated feeling he had when he saw Dake Dimming defeat Angus Jeffrey. The more he interacted with this young master of the Dimming family, the more he felt something. It was as if the golden generation led by the brave Blake during the war had walked out of the legends. Sometimes, he could not understand why there were so many geniuses in this world. He was clearly outstanding, but in front of those geniuses, he would always feel inferior. Every time he compared himself, he would try to remove his identity. Then, he would discover that in front of those geniuses, he was no different from an ordinary person. When he was young, he had poured out his heart to his father, who was the king. But the king had only told him that he should not have such thoughts. Everyone had something they were born with. They should not be jealous of others. Instead, they should dig for themselves. Moreover, there was no need for him to remove his identity and compare himself with others. Because his identity was his talent. He still could not understand that sentence. Even now, it was still the same. After pondering for a long time, Charles suddenly opened his eyes and looked at Dake, who had already sat down. His mind finally caught on to something. Will he become the next Valkyrie? Not the hero, but the Valkyrie? When this thought appeared, it was hard to suppress it. In the current kingdom, the hero was a character that had already passed away and only existed in legends. A person who had already passed away, no matter how great his reputation was, would not be a threat. Although the Valkyrie's reputation was slightly lower than the hero's, she was still alive and would live for a long time because of the saint's body. If after a few years, if Dake Dimming also grew to grow, the Diamond family might obtain a second battle god. Such a family, thinking in the long term, if we can't dim is. Dimming is dimming is dimming, dimming dimming GG dimming, to dimming GG dimming dimming, dimming GG, GGS's. It's just that the inclination needs to be adjusted a little. Eliza is favored by the Valkyrie. How can I rope in the Valkyrie's son? That's also a method. I have to think about it carefully. Charles sat on the sofa and pondered for a long time. Suddenly, he felt drunk and lay down. In the circular hallway, Jeffrey forced himself to chat with Dake for half an hour. After failing to pry into the secrets of the world of sin, he found an excuse to sneak away. Dake saw him leave and let out a sigh of relief. He actually did not like this kind of hypocritical social interaction. What was more surprising was that although Jeffrey had left, a few of the nobles in his circle had not. Both of them were young people. As long as there was no conflict of interest involved, they had endless topics to talk about. As they talked, Felix Raman could not help but mention the hero's son. For outsiders outside of the Shang Malian Academy, the topic of the hero's son was naturally very attractive. Many people wanted to know what the son of the hero Brett was like. Since Dake was in the same year, Felix could not help but ask. Dake smiled and casually said some unimportant information. He was not someone who would speak ill of others behind their backs, so it was just some random information. Felix heard some of it and said in surprise, "Wait, little Goad is from the Knight Academy? I thought. He must be from the Noble Academy." Dake blinked and said, "Maybe compared to his noble bloodline, his courage is more representative." Of course, he could not tell Felix that White had the other half of the Blood Clan's bloodline, or even the Demon King's blood. Felix and the others looked at each other and accepted his explanation. After all, White Gouda was the hero's son. It was normal for his courage to be more important than his bloodline. The group chatted for a while, then a fat noble youth suddenly asked, "I heard that the model Easter egg that your academy started selling at Easter was designed by a student?" Dake was slightly startled, then smiled and said, "That's right." "Oh." The noble youth exclaimed and said, "That's a really scary design. I heard that since Easter, your academy's model Easter egg has been very popular. Even now, the market is still expanding. If it develops well, do you know who that student is? I really want to ask him out for a drink." Dake said, "If it's just drinking tea." The noble youth saw that there was hope, so he quickly said, "It's not like that. I have some ideas for cooperation that I want to discuss with him." Dake was slightly interested. "What kind of cooperation? Can you mention it?" The noble youth looked around and was a little troubled. Felix looked at him coldly and said, "Eugenie, why are you keeping us in suspense?" Brown Eugenie scratched his head and said, "Raman, this is a trade secret." Felix looked at him with his chin and said, "You have a trade secret?" Brown blushed and said, "What's wrong with me? I've been in contact with the family business since the first half of this year. I'm not who I used to be." "Okay." Felix raised his eyebrows and said, "Then tell me your secret. I'll see if it's valuable." "Okay, Brown's expression suddenly froze, and he said angrily, "You tricked me again." "Okay." Felix smacked his lips and looked away. Dake said excitedly, "Eugenie, you're from the Eugenie conglomerate?" Brown's expression softened, and he said, "The Eugenie conglomerate is my family's conglomerate." Dake asked curiously, "Noble merchants, no problem?" Brown said, "Not in the past, but now it's different. Who would complain about having more money? However, the person in charge of the Eugenie conglomerate is still my uncle. He doesn't have a position in the kingdom." Dake nodded with a strange look in his eyes. He seemed to have seen the kingdom's future capitalization. However, in this era where individual power was becoming more and more exaggerated, the kingdom's future capitalization should be unique, right? The Dimming family was involved in politics and military, but they didn't seem to have made much progress in the field of commerce. For example, the soul-haunting guild hall that the Diamond family was involved in wasn't purely a place for profit. Compared to politics and military, Dake was more interested in commerce. After all, who didn't like him? Moreover, the development of Magicite technology required a lot of wealth. Although the Dimming family was rich, it belonged to the entire family. Even if he became the head of the family in the future, he couldn't use it without permission. If he could have his own conglomerate, he could use it as he wished. When that time came, he might even be able to use some of the Magicite technology. Dake raised his head and said, "I know the person who came up with the Easter egg. How about this, since tomorrow is Sunday, I'll help you arrange a time." "That would be the best," said Brown Eugenie. Dake smiled, "It's fine. How about tomorrow at 1 o'clock in the afternoon?" Brown was startled. "How can I accept that?" Dake leaned back on the sofa and said lazily, "What's there to be embarrassed about? We're all young people. We're just visiting each other. Or do you have something you can't say?" Brown turned his head and said awkwardly, "That's not it." Phyllis suddenly said, "You can go." Brown hesitated, "Then I'll really go?" "SK." Phyllis smacked his lips again, "What's there to hesitate about? If I could go to the War Goddess house, I'd definitely run over." Brown rubbed his hands and said, "That's true. It's tomorrow at 1 o'clock, right?" Dake smiled, "Yes, afternoon tea." Then he looked at the others and asked politely, "Do you want to come along?" Unexpectedly, these people who were obviously with Geoffrey nodded like rabbits. They couldn't wait to jump into the Duke's mansion. Dake was a little embarrassed, but he couldn't go back on his words. He could only ask Trina to write down the names of these people and let the guards let them in. Phillies was smiling so much that his eyebrows were curved. When it was close to evening, the young nobles all said their goodbyes. The remaining two also found an excuse to go somewhere else. After Dake was free, he had dinner with Deanna and the others along with the Magicite elves in the circular corridor. The water dance performance in the evening was unusually dazzling, and people couldn't help but linger. Especially the young ladies who wore tight-fitting school swimsuits. Their slender swan-like necks left a deep impression on people. However, the highlight of the day was still the Magic Duel exhibition tournament. Dake purposely stayed behind to enjoy this exhibition match. Formal duels were mainly about obtaining victory as quickly as possible. Therefore, the duelists would do everything they could to calculate every second of attack and defense. The spectating aspect of a duel was mainly the intense confrontation, not the various beautiful techniques used. But the exhibition match of the Magic Duel had a completely different focus. They were more inclined to show off their magnificent techniques during the duel, making the entire duel more dramatic. The special guest of this match, Butterfly Concubine, was an expert in exhibition matches. Of course, even in a formal duel, her techniques were extremely beautiful. After Dake and the others had their fill, they waited leisurely for Butterfly Concubine to come on stage. Along the way, many nobles came to greet them. Men and women, young and old, there were all kinds of people. But these people had some foresight. After greeting them, they left and didn't disturb them too much. Most of them came to leave an impression. Perhaps the next time they met, they could say to Dake, "Long time no see." 8:00 sharp. The exhibition match of the Magic Duel had finally begun. The duelist named Butterfly Concubine came on stage riding on a magic fairy. She was indeed a very beautiful lady. Her long red hair was tied behind her head, revealing the back of her slender white neck. She was tall and slender, but curvaceous. She wore a gorgeous performance costume, giving off the vibe of an actress. Her opponent was a professional duelist trained by the guild. Of course, she was also a beautiful lady. The performance of the duel between the two was extremely beautiful. People couldn't help but gasp in amazement. But halfway through, Dake couldn't help but shake his head. The appearance was beautiful, but the inside wasn't very good. This time, he realized the difference between the duelists of the outside world and the Shangmalian Academy. It was like a chasm. No wonder the duel competition in the academy is so popular. Tens of thousands of seats would be full. After thinking for a while, he decided to give up on the comparison and just watch as a performance. It was quite comfortable. When the Magic Duel was over, Dake didn't stay any longer. He called Deanna and the others and got on the carriage back. The carriage traveled through the silent night, immersed in the serenity of the moonlight. Bon voyage. Although the capital was a mixed bag of good and bad people recently, the majority of people cherished their lives. During this trip, Dake didn't even meet a single thief. He safely returned to the Duke's mansion. After entering the mansion, Dake invited Deanna to stay the night because it was already late. Deanna naturally didn't refuse. After Dake ordered the maid to deliver a letter to the Great Bell family, she happily went into Aurora's room. The two sisters were already prepared to talk through the night. Dake just smiled helplessly and returned to his room. Then, he took a shower and changed his clothes. After washing himself clean, he sat down in front of the lab table and called out the system panel. "System, display the indicators." "Yes." A moment later, 7 indicators appeared in Dake's vision. Pride, 98. Jealousy, 43. Fury, 77. Sloth, 67. Greed, 91. Gluttony, 78. Bliss, 91. Today was the 7th night of July. The numbers didn't change much since the beginning of the month. The system statistics didn't round up the numbers. It just directly omitted the numbers after the decimal point. During this period, other than jealousy and sloth, decreasing by 1 point each. Greed and bliss only increased slightly. The highlight of the day was undoubtedly pride. Before today, pride was only left with a little over 90 points. Now, it jumped to 98 points. Senior Jeffrey is such a good person. Looking at the pride that could be extracted 6 times, Dake couldn't help but sigh. He didn't care about Jeffrey's reason for doing this. This kind of child's play didn't affect him too much. On the contrary, in a situation where he was lacking experimental materials, he hoped that this kind of timely help would come a few more times. Anyway, let's have a drop of pride first. Every time he extracted pride, Dake felt sad. This was because he hadn't actually researched Pride's exclusive alchemy array. He hadn't even made any progress. This made the act of accumulating bit by bit feel indescribable. It was like a little squirrel storing up for winter, but winter didn't come. When pride accumulated to 30 points, he might not even have a clue. At that time, he might have to think of a way to use up the 30 points of pride. That would be a very sad thing. Dake sighed, hugged his left and right, and fell asleep. July 8th, afternoon. The weather was slightly gloomy. A few drops of rain fell, but the clouds hung in the sky and didn't fall for a long time. The weather was hot and stuffy. Phyllis Rahman, Brown Eugenie, and 3 other thick-skinned noble men and women came one after another. When Yvette found out that her baby had invited people to attend the tea party, she excitedly instructed Olga to treat them grandly. If she didn't have work to do, she would definitely do her duty as a good mother and personally attend to them. Dake was thankful that Yvette was busy with work and told Olga to keep things simple. He received the guests in the living room on the 2nd floor. Valkyrie, is the Duke not here? Phyllis asked impatiently when she saw Dake. Her eyes were filled with little stars. The situation in the capital hasn't been stable recently. Dake replied casually and quickly skipped the topic. Phyllis was visibly disappointed. However, when she reached the 2nd floor of the mansion, she was attracted by the paradise that filled the hallway. She was like Alice when she first entered the dream world. She lifted the corner of her dress and looked around. The other 4 noble children followed behind her, but they were trembling with fear. It was one thing to shamelessly accept an invitation, but it was another thing to do after actually coming. They had obviously been informed by their parents before coming. They were even more reserved than yesterday. After Dake led them into the living room, he dismissed the maids and personally made tea. That rather casual attitude made the nobles feel much more relaxed. Dake didn't really understand why these people wanted to attend the tea party that he casually suggested. However, this didn't stop him from being the host. Try this. It's a specialty of the Freedom City, lemon tea. Under the surprised gazes of Phyllis and the others, Dake picked up a square of ice from the icebox and put it into the lemon tea that had been soaked in cold water. As the mixture of ice and water mixed, the temperature of the lemon tea quickly dropped to the freezing point. Dake shook the glass teacups that he had specially chosen and brought them to them one by one. "Is this iced tea?" Phyllis couldn't help but ask. Dake smiled slightly. "A lime in the evening." While Phyllis and the others were carefully tasting the iced lemon tea, Deanna and Aurora walked into the living room, giggling. Phyllis was surprised by the presence of these two, but he didn't show it on his face. The fact that the Pearl of the Great Bear family had an intimate relationship with a young master of the Dimming family had long been spread in the circle of nobles, ladies, and young ladies. However, because the 2 of them weren't that old, the group of middle-aged women who were quite enthusiastic about marriage quickly put this matter aside. However, the young ladies of the nobles were quite concerned about this matter, especially those of the same age as Dake Dimming. Although Dake's reputation wasn't very good before, it wasn't as if there weren't any young masters who were more outrageous than him. In comparison, at least he didn't have any scandals between a man and a woman. In addition, his family background and identity, especially the fact that he was the son of the Valkyrie, added to his points. Yvette was the idol of the kingdom's women. As long as she married Dake Dimming, she could become his daughter. This was too attractive. Therefore, Dake had always been the top 3 choice of many young ladies of the same age when they were choosing a marriage partner. It was only because he wasn't old enough that the door of the Duke's mansion wasn't broken down. Now that Dake was only a year away from turning 14, there was suddenly an intimate member of the opposite sex by his side. It would be strange if he didn't attract attention. Although Phyllis wasn't interested in Dake, who was 3 years younger than himself, he was still very interested in watching the drama unfold. Seeing Deanna sit down next to Dake without any reservations, Phyllis's eyes suddenly narrowed and she smiled like a fox who had eaten a big piece of fruit. Perhaps after she walked out of the Duke's mansion today, the rumors of Dake and Deanna living together would spread uncontrollably. Dake himself didn't seem to notice at all. He made a cup of iced lemon for Deanna and Aurora, then said to Brown Eugenie, "Brown, is it convenient for you to talk about your business secrets here? If it's not convenient, we can go somewhere else." Brown rubbed his chubby cheeks and couldn't help but ask, "But what about the planner?" Dake pointed at himself with a smile. Brown was puzzled at first, then he was surprised, and then he said in astonishment, "Did you plan it?" Dake said slowly, "If you are talking about the planner of the model Easter egg, then it is indeed me. What do you want to work with me on?" Brown looked around and calmed himself down. "Let's go somewhere else?" "Then let's go somewhere else." Dake nodded and said to Phyllis and the others, "Let Aurora and Deanna entertain you first." With that, he walked out of the living room with Brown. Phyllis looked at his back and hammered with both hands, "Yes." In an empty room 2 rooms away, Dake asked Brown to sit down and asked, "Tell me about it." Brown looked at the Duke's son who had just turned 13 and suddenly felt a little ashamed. He was a little nervous, but he still said, "It's like this. Don't you think that the model Easter egg of the Shang-Malian Academy is very similar to the chess pieces of the magic chess?" "Chess pieces of the magic chess?" Dake thought for a moment and said, "Are you talking about the marketing of the model Easter egg and the magic chess?" For example, the models in the model Easter egg can be designed as the chess pieces of the magic chess. Brown nodded quickly. "That's right. Isn't this a very good idea?" You see, although the models in the model Easter egg have different popularity, in the end, they are only ornamental and collectible, and have no practical use value. But if they are to be combined with the magic chess, they will undoubtedly become more precious. Dake narrowed his eyes and said, "But you have to know that the production of the chess pieces of the magic chess costs money. If every model Easter egg is changed into a magic chess piece, first of all, the cost will increase dramatically, and ordinary people won't be able to afford it at all. Secondly, the magic chess is, after all, a niche game that is only spread among magic power users, and its gameplay is too complicated." Brown said subconsciously, "But we can improve it." Dake raised his hand to stop him from continuing. "I know, you want to simplify the rules of the magic chess and improve it into a game that doesn't require magic power to play. In this way, the cost of the chess pieces will also decrease. But since that's the case, why don't we just tailor a new game for the Easter egg model?" Brown, "Well," Dake smiled slightly, "in fact, there is already a ready-made game, and there's no need to tailor it at all. You know, nobody doesn't like magic duels." Brown didn't understand at all how the 13-year-old opposite him could say so many things in one breath that he didn't even think of. Dake, however, already had a relatively mature idea. The practicality of the Easter egg model is indeed a problem. Different times and environments will lead to changes in people's shopping habits. If there's no practical value, the popularity of the Easter egg model will indeed be difficult to maintain. And the audience will become narrower and narrower. A product that truly transcends time should be a national entertainment. As Brown listened, he couldn't help but open his eyes wide. He already didn't understand what Dake was trying to do. But in fact, Dake only came up with the idea of making the dual disc after receiving Brown's reminder. The so-called dual disc was originally a special dual prop used to project monsters and card effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! But that kind of projection prop actually had very high requirements for magical engineering technology. There were all kinds of complicated effects and all kinds of unimaginable chains. If they were to be realized, the dual disc would probably be the same as the magic chess piece, and would only be a niche product for magic users. Therefore, it was necessary to simplify it. Remove the complicated surekill skills and the settings of the health points, and only keep the attack and defense of the chess pieces, and at most, a sure kill skill that dealt direct damage or simple control. The projection of the dual disc didn't need to move, and only needed to launch an attack. This way, the duel would become very simple. As for the gameplay, it could be realized by adding in the rules of the magic duel and the turn-based summoning limit. Finally, in order to make the dual disc popular, it was necessary to develop a top-up card. No, a top-up card. Dake, who almost exposed his sinister intentions, continued, but if we want to imitate the magic duel, it's actually not convenient to use the Easter egg models. We can match each Easter egg model with a card that can be inserted into the dual disc and sell it as a bundle. Then, whether it's the people who want the Easter egg models or the dual cards, they will have to buy the Easter eggs. Brown was speechless. As he spoke, Dake became more and more interested. He directly took out the paper money and began to design. If this game could be successful, selling Easter egg models and cards was a profit point. Selling dual discs was another profit point. Selling top-up cards was another profit point. It would be hard not to make a lot of money. I just wanted to make some pocket money last night, and I didn't expect to have an idea today. Dake was naturally very excited. Half a day later, seeing how serious he was in his design, Brown quietly stood up and tried to leave the room. Dake looked up and asked, "Where are you going?" Brown's body stiffened, and he turned back and said awkwardly, "I won't bother you." Dake was puzzled. "Aren't we talking about a collaboration?" "This." Brown hesitated, "But that was your idea, I didn't contribute anything." Doc's mind stirred as he sensed his thoughts. He smiled and said, "That's not the case. The Eugenie Chamber of Commerce belongs to your family, right? If this plan succeeds, we will also need to distribute and promote it. When the time comes, there will be many areas where we will need to collaborate." After hearing this, Brown suddenly had an idea and quickly sat back down. Although he didn't provide any ideas for the plan, distribution and promotion were exactly what the Eugenie Chamber of Commerce was good at. If he could help his family get such a big business deal, his position in his family would be stable. When the time came, no one would dare to mock him for getting a 0 in school. "I, Brown Eugenie, am not stupid." Dake sorted out his thoughts and arranged the paper full of words, and smiled. "Don't be too anxious, this is only a plan after all. Whether it will succeed or not, and whether it can adapt to the market, is still unknown. It can only be said that with the success of the Easter egg model, the probability of success is relatively high. So you don't have to rush to tell your family." "I understand," Brown said immediately. "It's a business secret." Dake nodded and gave him a thumbs up with a look that said, "You know it very well." The relationship between the two of them became much closer in an instant. When they returned to the living room, they were already at a level where they could talk easily. Phyllis was surprised by the change in their relationship and asked curiously, "Seems like the collaboration went well?" "It went well." Dake nodded. In fact, there were 3 profit points in this plan. The biggest profit was definitely from the sales of the Easter egg model and cards, which belonged to the Shang Malian. His plan was to obtain the manufacturing and sales rights of the dual disc and the charging card, which were his profit points. The school would get the bigger profit, and he would get the smaller profit, so Professor Shi Erfu and Headmaster A Erdi wouldn't disagree. After all, he was the one who made the whole plan. But this matter is really not urgent. When the execution ceremony is over in mid-July, I will discuss it with my mother and Claire. At that time, I will choose a head made from my family to start a new Chamber of Commerce and contact the Shang Malian Academy. Let me think, the head made of Libra might be a good choice. Dake sat down on the sofa and opened his mouth to bite the grape that Anna handed to him. Of course, it was peeled. Following that, they spent the entire tea party in an ordinary manner. Because they were not familiar with each other, Dake didn't take them to the back of the mountain to play. When it was about 4 o'clock, the tea party was over, and the 5 guests left one after another. Except for Brown, who had gained something, and Phyllis, who had eaten melons, the other 3 aristocratic children were just going through the motions. No one knew what they were after. Maybe I should ask about their family's position? Dake supported his chin and thought about it. It should be easy to ask Crazy, the Scorpio, about this. But at the mention of Chris, he suddenly remembered the 2 elders of the Church of Knowledge he had met at noon yesterday. Hey, I forgot. So he got rid of Anna and Aurora, found Olga alone, and asked Olga to call Crazy. The petite Crazy was still dressed casually, and her single ponytail was casually swung behind her. Good afternoon, young master. When she came out of the shadow in the corner, Dake was already used to it. Sit. He pushed the iced lemon tea that he had brewed in advance to the opposite side. Crazy sat down, then picked up the teacup, stuck out her pink tongue, and gently licked it. The coldness and sweetness stimulated her taste buds at the same time, and she couldn't help but retract her tongue. Dake couldn't help but laugh. How is it? Crazy put the teacup to her mouth again, took a sip, and squinted her eyes to taste the tea for a long time. Then she said, "The tea given by young master is delicious even if it is highly toxic." Dake, can't you be more normal? Olga, who was standing on the side, couldn't help but cover her mouth and chuckle. Ice cubes and lemon tea really are 2 aspects of sublimation. It's such a simple combination, but I didn't think of it at all. Then she added, also, I have some ideas about the milk tea that young master talked about. Do you want to try it tonight? Dake nodded. Sure. Olga, but I'm making hot milk tea. Dake, milk tea is still hot and has soul. Olga's face was full of joy. Dake then said to Crazy, speaking of which, where's that guy called Ignaz Cooper? Is he still in the freezer? Chris shook her head and said carelessly, that person, huh? I was afraid that he would dirty the freezer, so I threw him out early in the morning. Where did you throw him? Dake asked curiously. Crazy said, Gray Mist Forest. Dake. There. Chris grinned, revealing a rare charming smile befitting her age of 25. She immediately said, doesn't he like to dream? I'll let him dream to his heart's content. Dake's expression froze as he recalled the gray mist dream he had experienced in the magic car. He couldn't help but ask curiously, what kind of dream will he have? With a flick of her finger, Crazy took out a 7-colored poisonous needle. She spun it slowly and said, it's probably a dream like the Viper Hell. If he likes snakes, he might forget to leave. Dake imagined it for a moment and couldn't help but shudder. Others didn't know, but if he was thrown into a pile of poisonous snakes, he didn't dare to think about it, In order to divert attention, he hurriedly said, it's been a month. Is he still alive? I don't know. Crazy shook her head. I'm not a demon. Of course, I had the forest ranger over there help keep him alive. As for whether the forest ranger did anything to him out of anger, that's not something I need to know. Maybe they have a good relationship and the forest ranger took good care of him? Ha ha, Dake laughed dryly, thinking that Crazy might have some misconceptions about the word demon. So he said, according to his previous idea, since he's still alive, let him stay there for another 2 months. When I start school, let him go. Crazy's lips curled. Understood. The young master was indeed merciful. He only punished that person for 3 months and let him go. Dake couldn't look at her smile, so he lowered his head and took a sip of iced lemon tea. He asked, then, have you checked the people who came to the mansion today? Chris revealed a professional smile. Of course I did. Last night, I sent the information to the Duke. If the young master wants a copy, I'll have someone send it over. Give me a copy. Dake nodded. Also, send someone to keep an eye on Aaron Leaders and Aviva Julius from the Church of Knowledge. Crazy gestured with her hand and asked softly, young master, what do you want? Dake blushed with shame. Respect the old and love the young. It's not easy for them to be so old. What I want to say is, if they forget to eat and sleep and their bodies can't take it, help them. Chris said, oh, I'm familiar with the forced sleep spell. All right, Dake said. Give me a copy of the information. Crazy nodded, but clearly had no intention of leaving. She sent a message through some unknown method, and soon, A maid from the Scorpio Palace maid squad knocked on the door and came in, handing a thick stack of information to Dake. Dake glanced at it, then put it on the table and began to read from the top. First, it was one of the 3 noble children at the top. Even though they had attended the tea party, Dake's impression of them was still very frivolous. He only knew their names. He flipped through it casually and understood. A fence sitter. Yes. Chris nodded. He's a dispensable person, if young master wants him to disappear. No need. Dake hurriedly raised his hand. Confused, Crazy asked, Young master, what are you thinking? I'm saying that you want him to avoid you. All right. Dake lowered his head and continued to read the next set of information. After reading through the information of the remaining 2 noble children, he realized that these 3 were really just bystanders. Even their parents were just freeloaders. But those who lived in the cracks were actually under a lot of pressure. He didn't mean to look down on them. He just shook his head and sighed. Of course, he couldn't be friends with such people. Then, he reached out for the information on Brown and Phillies, only to realize that the thick stack of information hadn't decreased at all. So whose information is this? Dake flipped through the information with a dark expression, then separated the information on Brown and Phillies. He was shocked to find that there were only 5 pages of information on Brown. The remaining 50 pages were all on Phillies. He couldn't help but look up at Crazy, but Crazy looked slightly proud, as if she had correctly figured out the Holy Will. But you were figuring out the Holy Will of Yvette, right? 5 in 110100 plus 0110/233. Another old person passed away. Birth, old age, sickness, and death really can't be avoided. Good thing they weren't close relatives. Anyway, my schedule has collapsed again. It's already 2:00. I need to save some tickets. I'll catch up on 2 hours of sleep later. I'll have to rush to the party again. Tragic. Chapter 500. Dake rubbed his forehead and looked at Brown Eugenie's information first. The Eugenie family was a very famous noble family in the royal capital, but unfortunately, it wasn't a very positive reputation. The family started out as a merchant and later became a noble by buying a title, but their reputation had always been bad. No matter what era it was, merchants would always give people the impression of being cunning, not to mention that they bought their titles. In order to change this situation, the previous head of the Eugenie family chose to support the army during the war. In the end, he won the king's appreciation, and the family's reputation was slightly changed. The current head of the Eugenie family was Grandette Eugenie, who now worked in the palace and was in charge of finance. Grandette was completely different from the previous head of the Eugenie family. He was a meticulous actuary who could not wait to split a holy coin into 2. But for the kingdom that was empty after the war, people like Grandette were indispensable. Since he took office, it became more and more difficult for the other departments to apply for funds from the finance department, causing complaints everywhere. Brown Eugenie was the 3rd son of Grandette Eugenie. Brown Eugenie studied at the Royal Academy in the royal capital. Now, the 5th grade had ended and the 6th grade had not yet begun. Remember, https://m. Vipcanshu. VIP Brown Eugenie's results were not ideal. And because his 2 elder brothers were too outstanding, it made him look even more incompetent. The Royal Academy's curriculum would end in the 5th grade, and the 6th grade was an internship year. One had to achieve the corresponding results to get a graduation certificate. Therefore, people who just dawdled could not graduate from the Royal Academy. This was the same in the Shangmalian Academy. In other words, if Brown Eugenie wanted to graduate, he had to do something. It just so happened that he was addicted to model Easter eggs some time ago and suddenly had the idea of combining model Easter eggs and magic chess. Of course, his idea was not mature. The developers of magic chess were not short of money, and it was difficult to persuade them to cooperate with him. But Dake was inspired by his suggestion, so it was reasonable to give him something in return. Let me see. The Eugenie family has not shown any political inclination so far. I'm afraid they've been observing the situation for a long time. But perhaps it was because of the king's appreciation that they got to where they are today. They are very loyal to the king. That is to say, the successor that the king finally decides on is very likely to be the one they will be loyal to in the future. Currently, they are neutral. It's all right. Dake finished reading Brown Eugenie's information and put it aside. He didn't really care about Eugenie's stance, as long as they didn't sponsor his opponents with the money he earned. After all, it was just one of the distributors. If they really wanted to promote the dual disc to all parts of the world, the best partners were actually the various dual halls, including the Shang Malian. Once they had a certain level of user base, they would consider distributing them to small workshops for sale. In short, this was the general process. Dake then casually took Felix Raman's information and started reading it. Felix's information was not essential to him. After all, the two sides had no fundamental interests involved. He just felt that it was more reassuring to take a look at his own position. It was just that the 50 pages of information made him feel a little scared. How detailed must they be to gather so much information? Dake shook his head and flipped to the first page. He was a little surprised when he saw it. It's actually from the Academy of Arcana? But after thinking about it, he felt relieved. Compared to the Shang Malian Academy, the Academy of Arcana was easier to get into. Kyle from the Dimming family was also a student of the Academy of Arcana, and he was specially recruited. In the royal city, if their children couldn't get into the Shang Malian Academy, then the nobles would often find ways to get their children into the Academy of Arcana. After that was the Royal Academy. The Royal Academy was different from the Shang Malian Academy and the Academy of Arcana. It taught more and more subjects. Magic, magecraft, and martial arts were just a part of it. On the other hand, the Shang Malian Academy and the Academy of Arcana were both magecraft academies. There were similar magecraft academies, but most of them were built after the war like bamboo shoots after the rain. Of course, there were also old magecraft academies that changed to magecraft academies. For example, the Elven Magic Academy, the Dwarven and Goblin Public Magic Academy, the Orc War Totem Academy. Although these academies couldn't compare to the Shang Malian Academy and the Academy of Arcana in terms of magecraft technology, because of the legacy of other technologies, their teaching was also very unique. Dake flipped through it casually and put Felix Raman's information back. The Raman family that Felix was in was an ancient family that had existed for hundreds of years. His father, Earl Rex Raman, was one of the 36 counselors. Because of their similar age and family background, Felix Raman and Angus Jeffrey had known each other since they were young. They would often get together like yesterday. But because Earl Raman only had one daughter, Felix Raman, he was very concerned about the promotion of women's status. Psychologically, he wasn't like the other old nobles who were against women inheriting the throne. Therefore, he didn't show much inclination towards eldest Prince Charles. In short, the information about the Raman family was more or less like this. As for Felix herself, Dake didn't care too much. After all, he didn't know when the next time would be. He didn't want to invite anyone for tea anymore. He wouldn't go out for a long time. Probably. The completion of Zoo and the temporary end of the combat armament course gave him more private time. The next topic was to refine 3 more magecraft fairies, thoroughly study Transformation Spell, and write Mathematics 2. As for learning Transformation Spell, he naturally had to ask Claire, who was very proficient in it. In this crucial period, Dake obviously wouldn't give her any trouble. Then let's refine the heart-drilling fairies first. July 9th. It was the second Monday of July. After 2 days of relaxation, the Magecraft fairies welcomed a busy day of learning again. Anna and Aurora continued to focus on self-learning, armament. Dark, on the other hand, looked for Ms. Plant. An apple with magic power? Ms. Plant was the former president of the Royal Botanical Garden and a magician who specialized in grass magic. Naturally, she was very proficient in magic plants. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call her a living encyclopedia. Dake gave her a cup of iced lemon tea and nodded. Yes, I want to find an apple with magic power to be the core of my Magecraft fairies. Do you have any recommendations? As the core of your Magecraft fairies? Ms. Plant thought for a while and said, "Although I don't know much about your magecraft fairies, if you want to use it as the core, you must have enough magic power and distinctive features, right?" Dake nodded. "If there is, of course, that would be great." Ms. Plant took a sip of the iced lemon tea and said, "Speaking of apples with large amounts of magic power, it would naturally be the golden apple. However, the Alliance of the 100 Races exists only in name now. It's almost impossible to obtain the golden apple from the elven lands or the home of fairies. In that case, can the more common self-exploding apple satisfy your conditions?" Self-exploding apple? Dake was surprised. Ms. Plant raised her wand and tapped it on the table. Then, a bit of magic power condensed into the shape of a seed at the tip of the wand. The magic seed quickly sprouted and grew. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a small apple tree. There were green and red apples on the tree. They were no different from ordinary apples. "This is the self-exploding apple." Ms. Plant tapped one of the apples lightly. With a pop sound, the apple exploded into pieces of magic power. Its appearance is no different from a normal apple. However, when an animal steals the apple and touches it, it will explode instantly, killing the animal on the spot. The dead animal's corpse will be pulled into the ground by the tree's roots and become fertilizer for the self-exploding apple. Therefore, although they look harmless, they are actually very dangerous. When adventuring in the wild, you must pay attention to the difference between the self-exploding apple and ordinary apples. Dake stared at the self-exploding apple tree formed by magic power and shook his head. If he wanted to refine grass-type magic elves that could self-explode like the iron seed ball or the nut dumbbell, he could mix in some elements of the self-exploding apple. However, since the goal was to refine the apple of greed, it was best not to use this kind of apple. Seeing him shake his head, Ms. Plant raised her wand and tapped the tip of the apple tree lightly. The self-exploding apple tree formed by magic power quickly collapsed and turned into a cluster of thorny poisonous vines. At the tip of the poisonous vine, there was a bright red apple. Then, what about this poisonous vine fruit? They usually attach themselves to large trees with lush foliage. They will wrap around the branches and dangle the tip of the apple from the branches, luring prey to approach. After hearing this, Dake couldn't help but take a closer look at the poisonous vine fruit. Then he shook his head and said, "Is there anything else? I mean, it's best to have some elements of a worm or a dragon." Dragon worm fruit? Ms. Plant proposed a new magic plant without hesitation. Then she said, "But it's not an apple-type magic plant. It can't even be considered a pure plant. It looks like this." The poisonous vine fruit transformed into magic power and finally condensed into a pineapple-shaped fruit. This dragonworm fruit looked like a pineapple, but there were scales on the fruit surface and a worm was born from the stalk. Dake raised his eyebrows and immediately had a feeling of, "This is it." He immediately asked, "What's the origin of this dragonworm fruit?" Ms. Plant smiled and said, "The dragonworm fruit is both a plant and a worm. It's the same as the dragonworm fruit. It's a companion species of a dragon. You can think of it as the product of the fusion of the dragonworm fruit and the worm's egg. Of course, in reality, it's not like that." Dake asked, "Then how can I get it?" Ms. Plant said unhurriedly, "If you want, I can contact someone from the Royal Botanic Garden to meet you." Dake said in realization, "So the Royal Botanic Garden grows it?" Ms. Plant nodded and said, "Yes, but it's a subspecies that was transplanted later. Pure dragon worm fruits can only be obtained in the Dragon Canyon, which is too difficult. Also, if you want, I can also specially cultivate apple-type dragon worm fruits." Dake said in surprise, "That works." Ms. Plant smiled and said, "It's just an ordinary magic plant grafting technique. It can be bred quickly by relying on magic. If everything goes well, it'll take a day or two at most. Also, if I remember correctly, there are still finished products in the Royal Botanic Garden. By the way, how many do you want?" Dake opened his mouth and said, "Of course, the more the better." Ms. Plant nodded and said, "Then I'll contact them when I go back tonight." So the next day, Dake, who had just decided not to go out, got into a carriage and went to the Royal Botanic Garden under Ms. Plant's lead. Of course, he was still accompanied by Katrina. The Royal Botanic Garden was not far from the palace. It was said that the Royal Botanic Garden was originally built inside the palace, but later on, the director of the Royal Botanic Garden transplanted very dangerous magic plants from somewhere, which caused a lot of commotion. So the Royal Botanic Garden was moved outside the palace. The reason why it wasn't closed down and was only forced to move, of course, it was because magic plants were more meaningful than ordinary plants. Even now, the old king often took his wife to the Royal Botanic Garden for walks. At around 9 in the morning, the Duke's carriage stopped at the entrance of the Royal Botanic Garden. Dake helped Ms. plant off the carriage and had the dragon tamer guards lead the carriage into the stable. Then they entered the Royal Botanic Garden. The guards of the Royal Botanic Garden had clearly been notified in advance and didn't stop them. Ms. Plant, as the former director, had just retired, so her power was still there and she was unimpeded. However, she deliberately avoided the dangerous magic plants and only walked through relatively safe paths. Even so, Dake saw a lot of strange plants. While he was amazed, he couldn't help but feel envious. What kind of plant is this? After seeing a banana tree that was more than 10 meters tall, Dake couldn't help but stop. Bananas were originally herbaceous plants. Although they looked like trees, they didn't have a real tree trunk. However, this huge banana tree in front of him clearly had a tree trunk. But after hearing this, Ms. Plant only asked in confusion, "Isn't this a banana tree?" Dake opened his mouth and couldn't say anything for a long time. Maybe the banana trees in this world are woody plants. He muttered and then asked, "Then does this banana tree have the essence of magic?" Ms. Plant smiled and said, "A normal banana tree isn't a magic plant, but if you want, I can cultivate a banana tree with magic." Dake scratched behind his ear and said hesitantly, "Can I book it first?" Ms. Plant joked, "Of course. I think the Duke won't go back on his word." Dake couldn't help but smile and feel happy. If he could cultivate a banana tree with magical powers and extract its essence, he might be able to use the remaining pride to create a tropical dragon with the characteristics of sun power, after failing to create pride. The sun power was a powerful characteristic that could absorb energy from the sun. Pokemon that could have the sun power characteristic were Charmander, Sunpede, Haraga, Tropical Dragon, and Umbrella Electric Lizard. From the name of this trait, it was obvious that it was very similar to Pride. If he used Dragon Grass to cultivate the Pride fruit, he would be able to obtain the essence of a dragon. Pride fruit, dragon, plus banana tree essence equals tropical dragon. Although this cultivation equation was a little idealistic, it was generally possible. However, the dragon grass that Dake cultivated was a blue dragon that was close to water. If he used it to cultivate a water-type violent carp dragon or mini dragon, it would complement each other. However, if he used it to cultivate a grass-type tropical dragon, it would be a little mysterious. Fortunately, water and grass had a certain degree of affinity. If he added more grass-type elements, he might be able to turn it from water to grass-type. In comparison, Dake actually wanted to use the Pride fruit, dragon, to cultivate a small fire dragon. However, because water and fire were incompatible, it was difficult to reconcile them. Unless there was a way to completely turn the water attribute into the fire attribute. If he wanted to cultivate a violent carp dragon, he would probably need the Fury fruit, dragon, or the Fury fruit, carp. As for the mini dragon, he would probably need the jealousy fruit. In the current situation, jealousy was more difficult to obtain, but fury wasn't difficult to obtain. The difficult part was the determination needed to obtain fury. Dake's current idea was to use the dragonworm fruit and the greed fruit, dragon, to cultivate a fruit-eating worm that could evolve into a apple-wrapping dragon or a honey-rich dragon. However, just like cultivating a tropical dragon, he would also need to add additional materials that could turn the water attribute into grass type. Therefore, he was still in the preparation stage. Following Ms. Plant, they continued to walk through the Royal Botanic Garden. Dake saw more magical plants that he had never heard of before, and he had gained a lot of knowledge. After about half an hour, the two finally arrived at the experimental garden where the dragon worm fruit was planted. Although the dragon worm fruit didn't have a special effect like the dragon saliva fruit, it was just as rare. In theory, a place without dragons can't cultivate a dragon worm fruit. However, we used a special method to graft the dragon worm fruit onto the branches of other trees, and we successfully cultivated a dragon worm fruit subspecies. Ms. Plant explained as she led the way. Because of this, the dragon worm fruit itself is an unstable existence. Changing the type of tree used for grafting can even greatly change the appearance of the dragon worm fruit. Dake didn't understand at first, but once he entered the dragon worm fruit experimental garden, he couldn't help but reveal a shocked expression. In the entire experimental garden, there were more than 10 types of fruit trees. Not only did it include the apple trees that Dake wanted, but there were also pear trees, orange trees, and many other fruit trees. These fruit trees didn't look any different from normal fruit trees. However, when someone entered the experimental garden, the apples, pears, and oranges all had colorful little worms crawling out of them. It made one's scalp tingle. Dake had only imagined the appearance of a single dragon worm fruit, but he didn't expect the visual impact of so many dragon worm fruits appearing together. At this moment, he couldn't help but look away. The corners of Ms. Plant's mouth curved slightly, and she said, "These dragon worm fruits are a rare species with two biological characteristics. They have the characteristics of a plant and a small portion of the characteristics of a worm. Although they aren't as magical as the catgrass you brought, they still have research value that can't be ignored." Speaking of which, the design of the catgrass was very likely inspired by the dragon worm fruit. Dake exhaled and asked, "Then how many can I take?" Ms. Plant thought for a moment and gestured, 3. 3 is good." Dake nodded. With 3 dragon worm fruits, if everything went well, he could even refine 3 fruit-gnawing worms. Although he didn't have enough greed now, he would be able to gather enough in the future. "Do you want to pick one yourself?" Ms. Plant asked again. Dake said, "Can I?" Ms. Plant smiled and nodded. Dake suppressed his physical disgust and said, "Then I'll pick one." The fruit-gnawing worm was a Pokemon like a snail. Its body was that of a green worm, and it lived in the shell of an apple. The taste of the apple would determine its evolution direction. If its apple was sour, it would evolve into apple wrapping dragon. If its apple was sweet, it would evolve into honey dragon. Based on this consideration, Dake specially chose a half-ripe green apple and 2 ripe red apples. Considering that he couldn't be sure if the unripe green apple would have any negative effects on the experiment, he only chose one. As for the holy coins needed to purchase these 3 dragon worm fruits, it would naturally be paid by the personal maid. Dake Dimming never brought money when he went out. After the selection was completed, Dake hurriedly left the experiment garden. Then, he thought for a moment and said his request, "Ms. Plant, is there any special material that can convert the water element to the grass element?" "Why do you have such a question?" Ms. Plant was surprised. "It's not easy to convert between elements." Dake deliberated and said, "I have a material that has a factor that I need, but it's a water element. What I want to refine is a grass element magic guide sprite." "Just the dragon worm fruit won't do?" Ms. Plant asked. Dake said, "There's a possibility, but I need more insurance to further reduce the range of refining." Ms. Plant thought for a moment and said, "It's still the same thing. My knowledge of magic guide sprite is limited. However, there's no inherent conflict between the water and grass elements. You can add more grass elements to cover up the water element." Dake said, "I think so too. But what if I want to use that water element material to refine a fire element magic guide sprite? How can the conflict between water and fire be resolved?" Ms. Plant couldn't help but frown. "If it's water and fire, perhaps you can first remove the water element from the material and then add the fire element. I suggest you ask Cyrus about this. After all, it's related to magic guide sprite. My experience may cause some mistakes." Dake thought carefully and said, "Then I'll have to ask when I get back." Ms. Plant relaxed and said, "Then, since we're here, Do you want to continue the tour? Dake asked. May I? Ms. Plant nodded with a smile. Of course. I've cultivated some special magic plants in the garden. I'll take you to see them. Dake was puzzled. Special magic plants can't use magic, right? Ms. Plant was stunned for a moment before she smiled and said, You guessed it. You know, although some magic plants can use some innate skills, they can't be considered magic. My plants, on the other hand, can use magic. Ms. Plant was very amiable, especially when she introduced her plants. She was as gentle as if she was introducing a child. Dake looked at the magic-chanting morning glory rubbing against her palm like a child and couldn't help but think of his own catnip plants. Since these morning glory flowers that couldn't make any sound could chant magic, why couldn't the catnip plants that could meow do the same? In theory, it should be easier for magic guide sprites to learn magic. But after comforting the morning glory, Ms. Plant looked up and said, Do you think that since these plants can learn to chant magic, your magic guide sprites should be able to learn it easier? Dake nodded awkwardly. Ms. Plant shook her head slightly and smiled. That's not the logic. The magic I teach these plants is a special magic that has been adjusted according to their own characteristics. This is the patent of plants. And if your magic guide sprites want to learn magic, they still need brains. After I finish teaching the basics, I'll start a basic magic class. If you want, you can come and listen. Dake not only visited the botanical garden to his heart's content, but he also had a meal with Ms. Plant. The vegetables and fruits grown in the Royal Botanical Garden tasted amazing. Just by casually frying them, they were extremely fragrant and delicious, leaving a deep impression on Dake. After resting for a while, they returned to the Duke's mansion in a carriage. They didn't encounter any obstacles along the way. After returning to the Duke's mansion, Dake put away the 3 apple-shaped dragonworm fruits and immediately went to find silent sage Cyrus. Cyrus was teaching seriously, so Dake listened outside the door for a while. The magic guide sprites all looked very serious. After Ms. Plant's teaching, the trash slime that didn't have enough intelligence seemed to have become a lot smarter. Its soft body gathered into a small pile and it used a small pen to write on a piece of paper. Although it looked a little crooked because of its lack of strength, it still looked like it was writing. The mischievous dream demon was surprisingly quiet in class. Dake glanced at the small bottle on the table and knew that it contained the mind-calming potion personally concocted by Sage Cyrus. According to Sage Cyrus, the dream demon's restlessness was engraved in its genes and determined by its life structure. It was like depression. It looked like a mental illness, but it was actually a physical illness. Therefore, if one wanted to calm the dream demon down, they would need to use some potions. All potions had side effects and too much of it would have side effects. However, as long as the magic guide sprite's magic power dissipated, it would return to the card in its purest form, so there was no need to worry about that. Looking at the dream demon taking potions and studying, Dake couldn't help but think of the students who took potions to revise for the college entrance exam. The dream demon is working so hard. It doesn't make sense for it to fall behind in the mid-month test, right? Dake shook his head and waited for the class to end. As if sensing that Dake was outside the wall, the magic guide sprites raised their hands and spoke enthusiastically. Sage Cyrus vaguely glanced in Dake's direction and continued with the class. When the class finally ended, Dake walked into the classroom. How was the trip to the Royal Botanic Garden? Sage Cyrus asked before Dake could speak. Dake recalled what he saw in the garden and said, It was all right. As expected of a senior sorcerer specializing in grass, Ms. Plant. I learned a lot. Sage Cyrus packed his things and asked, So, are you here for something related to that? Yes. Doc nodded and began to list out his requests one by one. After listening carefully, Sage Cyrus said, So, it's about the attribute conversion? Yes, I'd like to ask, Dake said. Cyrus picked up the documents and walked out of the classroom. Let's go to my office first. The 4 tutors' offices were right next to the classroom. Cyrus asked Dake to sit opposite the desk and said, All right, you can tell me now. What kind of material do you want to convert? Dake thought for a moment and said, How should I put it? It should be a plant fruit that contains mental power and animal factors, right? What? Sage Cyrus couldn't help but rub the corners of his eyes, thinking that he must be too old to hear clearly. Dake repeated, a plant fruit that contains mental power and animal factors. Sage Cyrus was speechless. Did your cat grass bear fruit? Dake smiled knowingly. That's how it is. Cyrus put down his hands and said, if it's the fruit of cat grass, it'll use the plant as the carrier. The elemental attributes of plants are relatively easy to remove. However, the grass and water attributes are not included. If you want to convert a water attribute plant to a grass attribute, it's completely unnecessary. Because the fruit of cat grass has the grass attribute, it's just that it's not obvious on the surface. However, the refinement of magic is actually a process of removing the impurities and preserving the essences. If it's me, I can directly separate the water and grass attributes during the refinement process, then eliminate the unnecessary attributes and highlight the needed attributes. But for you, you can't do it for now. At this time, you just need to add some grass attribute powder. Grass attribute powder? Dake frowned slightly, suddenly feeling that he might have made a mistake somewhere. All this time, when he relied on the fruit of great sin to refine a magic fairy, he had added the corresponding attribute powder. This time, if he wanted to refine a fruit-eating bug or a tropical dragon, he would definitely add grass attribute powder. In other words, there was no need to think so much. There was no conflict between the water and grass attributes. The reason why he suddenly had this concern was that the cat grass apart from the dragon grass did not show any inclination towards the water attribute. Then what if I want to use the fruit of cat grass to refine a fire attribute magic fairy? He could not help but ask. Cyrus looked into his eyes and shook his head. I can't do it. Dake couldn't help but ask hesitantly, why not? Cyrus rolled its eyes at him. You can roast your cat grass in a brazier and see if it will still meow. Dake said, yes, it will still meow. Cyrus heaved a sigh. So, why do you have to use the fruit of cat grass to refine a fire attribute magic fairy? It's fine if it's only one attribute, but both the grass and water attributes strongly conflict with the fire attribute. Dake thought for a moment and said, I don't need the plant elements of the cat grass, but the animal elements. Cyrus said, if that's the case, why don't you find a real animal? Dake said, because animals don't bear fruit. Cyrus. It seemed that it didn't make sense. Dake secretly heaved a sigh. Sure enough, even the sages had their limits. In that case, if he wanted to refine a small fire dragon, he would have to find another dragon grass that did not have any attributes. The attributes of the tiny grass could be easily removed during the magic refinement process. However, the dragon grass in front of him was an unexpected product when he was developing the loach grass. If he wanted to wait until the kitty flower shop developed another dragon grass, he didn't know how long it would take. Should I change my approach and use lizard grass? After all, a small fire dragon doesn't have a dragon attribute. After that, Dake sat in Cyrus's office for a while longer and asked some questions about magic, which were all answered patiently. Then, he expressed his gratitude to Cyrus and quickly left. Since the refinement of the fruit-eating bug didn't have any conflict of attributes, there was no need to wait until tomorrow. After Dake returned to his room, he made himself a cup of apple juice and began to prepare for the experiment while it was still early. When was the last time I refined a magic fairy? Dake pondered as he prepared. However, when he started, he realized that he wasn't unfamiliar with the process at all. It was as if all the steps had been engraved into his bones and there was no room for mistakes. He had been preparing for this experiment on the fruit-gnawing bug for a long time. The refinement method is dragon grass attribute. The core materials are fruit of greed and apple-shaped dragon worm fruit. What needs to be prepared are fairy honey, brain leaf essence, active egg liquid, grass attribute powder, large amount. Let's start with the fruit of greed. Dake quickly fished out the dragon grass from the dark water tank. Timid and afraid of light, it couldn't help but squint its eyes and cry out softly. Dake carefully wiped the water off its body and carried it to the bug tree. He put its mouth on the tip of the bug branch that was filled with greed. Slurp, the dragon grass quickly forgot its fear and was intoxicated by the sucking. After it had absorbed 7 points of greed, a dark blue and purple flower of greed gradually bloomed and slowly gave birth to a fruit of greed. Dake plucked the fruit of greed from its head and cut off the stem of greed to preserve it. He then put it back into the water tank. It immediately let out a cheerful cry, and then curled itself into a ball. Dake carefully covered it with a black cloth to block the light and turned around to put the fruit of greed on the table. He then picked the greenest one out of the 3 dragon worm fruits. First, he had to kill the dragon worm fruit. The body of the dragon worm fruit wasn't a real worm. It only had some of the characteristics of a worm and was more similar to a plant. It didn't have its own thoughts. However, before refining it, he still had to kill the worm so that it wouldn't have any negative reactions. Because he was following Ms. Plant's instructions, it took him a long time to complete the kill process. He then used a special method to activate the magic in the dragon worm fruit. After the dragon worm fruit was processed, Dake didn't forget to borrow kettle pot from the classroom to ferment the fruit of greed into juice. As for the dragon worm fruit, it was preserved in its original form so that its characteristics wouldn't be destroyed. Dake called a maid to send kettle pot back to the classroom and began the refinement experiment. He first took a deep breath to focus his mind and began to fully immerse himself in the experiment. Even though he had 3 dragon worm fruits, the 7 points of greed that he had already used would not be regenerated. Therefore, he could only succeed in this refinement. There was no room for failure. Soon, he spread the fairy honey evenly on the blank magic card and poured a drop of brain lobe essence on it. After it was slightly dried, he applied a layer of transparent yellow, active egg liquid, and sprinkled the grass attribute powder on it. In order to ensure the grass attribute's preference, he used 3 times the usual amount. Half an hour later, Dake completed all the steps in the early and middle stages of the refinement process and quickly and accurately engraved the first refinement circle. During the process, he thought of using the water dragon lizard's blood to replace the mercury core of the magic pen. However, considering that the water dragon lizard was a water attribute dragon, he decisively gave up on that idea. In the end, the refinement circle number 1 was considered perfect. He injected his mana and activated the refinement circle number 1. Then, he poured in the juice of the fruit of greed, dragon, and his saliva as catalyst and mixed them together. When a nebula-like whirlpool appeared in the light circle of the refinement circle, he carefully placed the processed dragon worm fruit into it. Finally, he sprinkled in some grass attribute powder and other supplementary materials. The light of the refinement circle number 1 gradually became brighter and brighter. All the materials were fused and refined. Glowing threads drilled out from the surface of the card and weaved the card into a white cocoon. After that, he waited for 4 minutes. When the reaction inside the cocoon completely stopped, Dake used a mercury knife to cut it open. The light that drilled out from the gap made him realize that the experiment this time was also successful. When the light cocoon suddenly spread to both sides like silk, a pool of unexpectedly clear viscous liquid flowed out with a splash. Dake quickly took a towel and wrapped it in a circle to prevent the liquid from flowing under the table. While he was doing that, his gaze drifted to the magic card that had clearly been completed. There was no dirt on the surface of the card, and the edge of the card emitted a faint golden halo. It was undoubtedly the symbol of a gold card. Dake was quite used to this. His focus was on the magic card itself. What kind of magic fairy was refined? Was it a fruit eater? The pattern of the magic fairy on the surface of the card gradually became clear. It was obviously a completely different outline from the apple-shaped fruit eater. Was it a grass treasure dream that also had the glutton characteristic, trumpet sprout, or cauliflower monkey? Obviously not. The magic fairy that appeared on the surface of the card was neither grass attribute nor water attribute. It was not even a dragon. This made Dake couldn't help but reveal an unusually shocked expression. Although this kind of basic refinement method had the same randomness in theory, after all, it was divided into races and attributes. Moreover, the materials used were all related types. Under normal circumstances, there shouldn't be a situation of creating something out of nothing. But this time, the magic fairy refined just happened to have such a situation. He picked up the magic card with a subtle feeling in his heart and looked at it carefully. Then, he couldn't help but laugh out loud. The magic fairy in front of him indeed had the feeling of accepting all rivers into the sea. 5 in 110500 plus 0113/233. Damn. I wrote for 16 hours. Chapter 501. As the saying goes, if you plant flowers, they won't bloom, but if you plant a willow, it will grow. Dake's feelings for Pokemon actually came from the first Wuji chapter. After he found out that the random magic guide sprite he created would lean towards Pokemon, Digimon, and Yu-Gi-Oh! For some reason, the first thing he thought of was those familiar Pokemon in the Wuji chapter. Like Charmander, Jenny Turtle, Wonderful Frog, and Pikachu, they were all his favorite magic guide sprites. Unfortunately, he couldn't create any of them. Fortunately, he had the cute little Ibu to warm his heart. After that, he also had Kettle and Milk Jug to satisfy his appetite. As for the Pokemon that appeared in later generations like the fruit gnawing bug, he actually didn't think too much about it. Therefore, he didn't care if he made a mistake this time. Anyway, he still had 2 dragon worm fruits, right? Now, the key point was which part of the magic guide sprite was wrong. Walala. The first URL was https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP. The water flowed down, washing away all the sticky liquid on the magic guide card. Dake picked up the magic guide card again, and after wiping it dry, he sat back in front of the experiment table. Looking at it, he couldn't help but laugh. Maybe this is my luck? Unfortunately, there's still a flaw in it. It would be better if it was a Snorlax directly. Yes, on the surface of this magic guide sprite card, there was a little Snorlax lying on its back. Little Snorlax was Snorlax's infant form, with dark blue skin and a small white belly. It was a Pokemon that people couldn't help but want to hug and eat. Compared to Snorlax that slept after eating and ate after sleeping, little Snorlax was much more lively and active. But its appetite was still amazing. It was said that little Snorlax would eat the same amount of food as its body weight in one breath every day, and when it ate, it would swallow it all without chewing. Little Snorlax was used to hiding its food in its long body hair, but when it desperately ate, it would forget about the food hidden under its body hair. On the surface, little Snorlax was very compatible with great sin. Whether it was greed, gluttony, or sloth, they should be compatible with it. Unfortunately, it didn't have as many forms of evolution as Ivan did. Even if it used different great sins, it would still evolve into a Snorlax. Little Snorlax belongs to the category of a common elemental magic guide fairy. It can contain most of the attributes. However, the probability of refining a little Snorlax using dragon grass as the foundation is still extremely low. However, I've been using this basic refining method to refine a magic guiding fairy for almost a year, and I haven't made any mistakes. Based on probability, it should be slightly more than once. Dake smiled and infused his magical power into the magic card of little Snorlax. After that, some related information was transmitted to his brain through the feedback of the magic power. Card name, Little Snorlax. Type, Elf card. Level, ****. Race, bird. Attribute, normal magic power, 2000 attack, 1000 defense, 1000 killing skills, pick up, charge up, pray for rain, seed bomb, it's a bird species. Dake breathed a sigh of relief. Whether or not little Snorlax was a bird species was related to whether it could be used in the zoo. Dake couldn't tell whether it was a bear, a sloth, or a fat cat. Therefore, he couldn't determine its race at the moment. However, since he was sure that it was a bird species, there was no point to investigate further. Its level is 3 stars, and its attribute is normal. It's just within the first tier, so I can summon it directly. If I use Greed 3, it should be able to evolve into a second-tier Snorlax. I wonder if the evolved Snorlax will be 5-star or 6-star. Dream Demon evolved from Bliss 3 into Dream Demon, which belongs to 5-star. The probability of Snorlax being 5-star is higher. Anyway, I'm not in a hurry. Let's talk about it after I've thoroughly studied the data of Little Snorlax. Dake continued to read on excitedly. Little Snorlax's 3 body parts were not particularly strong. Its magic power was 500 points higher than the 3-star top level, which indeed increased its HP. However, as a meat core, its defense was only 1,000 points. It looks so fat, but its defense is not high? Dake thought. Little Snorlax's attack and defense were only 1,000 points, which meant that it was difficult for it to be a strong attacker, and it was also not a competent meat shield. It seemed that he could only rely on his ultimate skill. However, since it was a gold card, there should be at least one rare ultimate skill among the 4 ultimate skills. Dake turned his attention to the ultimate skill of Little Snorlax, and then he continued to infuse his magic power to analyze it. Among the 4 ultimate skills of Little Snorlax, the first one was Pick Up, and it was not Gluttonous Ghost, as Dake had guessed. However, whether it was Pick Up or Gluttonous Ghost, they were both ultimate skills that could show the nature of greed. Comparing the two, the characteristic of Gluttonous Ghost, which could only let Little Snorlax eat fruits automatically when its HP was reduced by half, was obviously not as good as Pick Up in reality. However, the original effect of Pick Up was also too gamey. Presumably, there would be a certain degree of adjustment on Little Snorlax. Pick Up. During the battle, it can pick up the items dropped or discarded by others, and temporarily gain the right to use them. The opponent cannot retrieve or remove them. Pick Up. Additional effect: Little Snorlax is greedy for everything it doesn't have, especially food, and it often picks up some items, food, that were discarded or placed by others. Temporarily gain the right to use them? Dake's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately sensed something from the simple description. In this world, because of the existence of magic, many items had a strong personal magic mark, and it was difficult to use them even if they were taken away. Even the mages would engrave Thinking Lock on their magic cards to prevent their magic cards from being stolen by others. As for the high-end magic cards with obvious personalization, even if there was no Thinking Lock, they could not be used by others. Therefore, in a magic duel, even if one took away the items, including weapons, from the opponent's hands, there was a high probability that it could only exert the physical effect of smashing the opponent, and it could not activate its effect and ability. However, with the passive sure kill skill Pick Up, Little Snorlax could gain the right to use the items dropped or discarded by others for a short period of time, and the opponent could not even remove the summoning right away. In fact, Ivan's Desire and Meow Meow's Thief had a similar snatching effect. However, in comparison, the effect of Desire and Thief was obviously not as powerful as the effect of Pick Up. Dake even suspected that if he threw the single scabbard on the ground, Little Snorlax might be able to pick it up and use it. In that case, there would be more room for error. At present, among his magic fairy, only the Delu Beast and the Lion Beast with the Brave quality could activate the true power of the single scabbard. However, if Little Snorlax's Pick Up was really effective, there might be another possibility. This sure kill skill may be unexpectedly useful at certain critical moments. Dake couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. After a while, he continued to look at the additional effect of Pick Up. The additional effect of Pick Up was literally very similar to Meow Meow's Treasure Gathering Art additional effect. The difference was that Meow Meow could summon real treasures, while Little Snorlax was very likely to pick up expired food equals. Dake had always thought that his reading and comprehension ability was not bad. If my understanding is not wrong, I might have to give it a bath every day in the future, so that it won't hide the expired food in its hair and rot day by day. He touched his forehead and felt that this additional effect was very likely to be a trap. Moreover, different from the treasure gathering artist, occasionally, the description of the additional effect of Pick Up was often. Thinking about it carefully, wasn't it more terrifying? Dake tried not to think of the worst and continued to look at the next sure kill skill. The second sure kill skill of Little Snorlax was called Storing Power. If he didn't get the information from the magic card, Dake couldn't even remember the effect of this skill. It was just so inconspicuous. Storing Power. Accumulates power through eating to increase one's defense. The maximum number of accumulations is 3 times, and each time can increase one's basic defense by 50%. The accumulated power can be spit and swallow. Every time a layer of accumulations is consumed, the defense increased through storing power will be restored. Storing Power. Spit spits the accumulated power at the opponent to attack. The more accumulated power, the stronger the power. The attack power of Storing Power is equivalent to the number of times of storing power multiplied by the basic attack. Storing Power. Swallow the accumulated power to recover one's magic power. The more accumulated power, the greater the recovery. The magic power recovered depends on the number of layers of accumulations consumed. 1 layer of accumulations can recover 1/4 of the total magic power, 2 layers of accumulations can recover 1/2 of the total magic power, and 3 layers of accumulations can recover all the magic power. Why do I feel that there are 3 sure kill skills instead of a single sure kill skill? Dake had a strange look and looked at it carefully again. He had a deeper understanding of the sure kill skill, Storing Power. This sure kill skill, even if listed separately, could be called a divine skill. It only needed to accumulate power through eating, and it could increase the defense of Little Snorlax from 1,000 points to 2,500 points. This would make Little Snorlax have an unprecedented increase in its calmness. 2,000 points of magic power and 2,500 points of defense. It was hard to imagine that this was a first-tier magic guide elf. Even Kettle didn't have such a level of data on the panel. Moreover, with Spit and Swallow, Little Snorlax could even gain the ability to attack or recover its health at the cost of sacrificing its defense. The difficulty was perhaps feeding it? Feeding a magic guide elf? It sounded ridiculous at first. But if it was a magic guide elf of Dake Dimeng, it would be normal. However, if he wanted to feed Little Snorlax, he would need 105 kilograms of food, which was exactly 210 pounds of food. Assuming that 1 layer of storing power could be obtained by feeding it once, he would need to feed it 3 times in a row to obtain 3 layers of storing power. Since it could be full, it could also be hungry. Maybe when Little Snorlax was hungry, the number of layers of storing power would be reduced. In this case, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call it a gold-swallowing beast. It was definitely not something that ordinary people could afford to feed. Dake shook his head slightly. There was plenty of food in the Duke's mansion. Even if he returned to the academy, with the high remuneration he received from writing the textbook, he wouldn't let it go hungry. Fortunately, your master is rich enough. Doc rubbed Snorlax's belly with his fingertips. Then, he saw it smacking its lips in the magic card. It raised its paw and scratched its belly. Then, it turned over and continued to sleep. Dake couldn't help but reveal a warm smile, then he continued to look at the next sure kill skill. The remaining 2 sure kill skills of Little Snorlax were Praying for Rain and Seed Bomb. From the names, it could be seen that they were sure kill skills of Water Element and Grass Element respectively. Is it because Water Element and Grass Element materials were used during the refining process? Dake thought for a while and continued to look. Praying for Rain was a very famous field skill. He had a deep impression, but his impression of Seed Bomb was very shallow. Praying for Rain. Pray to the water spirit and summon rain. It will rain continuously for 5 rounds, thus increasing the power of the sure kill skill of the water element and suppressing the power of the sure kill skill of the fire element. The power of the sure kill skill of the water element is increased by 50%, and the power of the sure kill skill of the fire element is decreased by 50%. A weather-related field skill. It is ridiculously effective against the fire element. When the symbol of Mercury, Envy, comes online, maybe I can add this Little Snorlax to the Envy deck to replace the field card. After Dake gave Praying for Rain a great affirmation, he looked at Seed Bomb. Seed Bomb. create a big seed with a hard shell. Shoot the seed out like a bomb to attack the opponent. Seed Bomb's power in Pokemon was 80. It was not as good as Fairy Ibu's Moon Force, but it was above the passing line. It was not weak. But that was it. Compared with the other 3 sure kill skills of little Snorlax, it was more like a little something better than nothing. I can't always expect the 4 sure kill skills to be all-powerful. Dake smiled, picked up the magic card of little Snorlax, and then walked to a relatively empty place. Next, he would summon little Snorlax and try out Greed 3. In the name of Dake Dimeng, I summon the magic card. It's decided to be you, little Snorlax. Along with the unhurried chanting, the summoning light shot out from the card and shone on the carpet. A chubby blue cutie came out of the card and then materialized in the summoning light. Wheeze, little Snorlax, who came to this world for the first time, was still sleeping soundly. Dake squatted down next to it, and then stretched out his finger to poke at its small white belly. His fingers sank deeply into the soft flesh surrounding her. The soft meat that was full of elasticity squeezed from both sides, making people unable to stop. Dake almost forgot his purpose. After he woke up, he retracted his hand as if he got an electric shock, and said reluctantly, "It's time to get up, little Snorlax." Little Snorlax. Wheeze, Dake. Little Snorlax with Greed is already so good at sleeping, if it's Sloth, wouldn't it be finished? He thought for a while, and then changed his words, "It's time to eat." Kaku. Little Snorlax opened its round eyes in a daze, and looked at its master who gave it a familiar feeling. Kaku. Kaku. Dake originally wanted to catch it with some food, but he didn't expect that it would be hooked with only one sentence. Since it was hooked, of course, he wouldn't take any more food. Little Snorlax, you can only blame yourself for not living up to expectations. Dake suddenly hugged its head and rubbed it for a while, and then he was caught off guard by little Snorlax's tongue lick attack. Fortunately, it was just an ordinary lick, and not the real tongue lick, or else his whole body would be paralyzed. Dake wiped off the saliva on his face, and then he carefully observed little Snorlax. Little Snorlax was about 0.6 meters tall, but it weighed about 210 pounds. Its shape and shape were the same as Snorlax, and in fact, it looked a bit like the chinchilla described by Hayao Miyazaki. While he was observing, Dake suddenly looked into little Snorlax's eyes. Then he saw the desire and greed for delicious food in its eyes. Kaku. Little Snorlax unexpectedly sat up, and then with a paw-gee, it hugged Dake and rubbed against his face for a while. In order to show the majesty of its master, Dake rubbed back against it without hesitation. Suddenly, the room was filled with decadent sounds. There was a natural connection between a magus and a magic-conducting elf. They didn't need to go through the process of familiarization, and both of them were already like old acquaintances who had been together for more than 10 years. After Dake and little Snorlax were lovey-dovey for a while, he promised it, "Be a good boy and cooperate with the experiment, and I'll take you to have a big meal after the experiment is over." Little Snorlax licked the corner of its mouth, and quickly nodded. "Really?" Dake took out a tissue and wiped off the saliva from the corner of its mouth, then he took out the Greed 3 card, faced it with the card, and began to summon. In the name of Dake Dimeng, magic conducting summoning. Along with the completion of the usual summoning spell, an extremely deep dark blue light bloomed from the surface of the Greed 3 card. Little Snorlax curiously looked at the light that was shining on itself, and stretched out its paw to touch it, but of course, it touched nothing. When it felt a sense of loss, the Greed emblem lit up on its forehead. The surrounding dark blue light was fiercely absorbed by the emblem, and little Snorlax's body gradually glowed. Under the shroud of the light of evolution, its body expanded at an extremely fast speed. In the blink of an eye, it turned from a 0.6 meter tall little cutie to a 2.1 meter tall big cutie. 5000 plus, half of the mission is completed, the other half is completed before 6 o'clock, and I'm looking for monthly votes for the new month. Chapter 502. Little Snorlax's evolution was within his expectation. But when he saw Snorlax in front of him, which had a strong presence in the first Princeless chapter, Dake couldn't help but reveal an excited expression. Compared to little Snorlax, which was still in its infancy, Snorlax was obviously more mature and softer. Dake didn't do anything, but directly put his whole body on its belly, and then let out a sigh of satisfaction. Snorlax's body color was close to blue or navy blue, and its belly was white. Its eyes were always narrowed, as if no one had ever seen it open its eyes. It was obviously more sleepy than little Snorlax when it was still a baby. It had just evolved, but it had already started to wobble. If Dake, as its owner, wasn't enjoying its belly, it would have directly laid down on its back and fell into a deep sleep. Snorlax was just like its appearance. It was naturally docile. When it lay down on its back, its fat belly would become a playground for small animals. But no one should ever wake it up when it was sleeping, because that would make it lose its temper and express its dissatisfaction. In short, it would sleep when it was full, and eat when it woke up. With its strong stomach, no matter what kind of things it was, it could digest them with its gastric juice, even poisonous and rotten things. Remember the website, Vipcanshu. VIP. Since its weight had increased from 105 kilograms to 460 kilograms, Snorlax's appetite had also increased to 460 kilograms, which was exactly 920 kilograms. If it didn't eat 460 kilograms of food a day, Snorlax would feel sad. Compared to greed, Dake had always thought that gluttony and sloth were more compatible with it. But at present, greed's compatibility was already high enough. After a long while, Dake thought that Snorlax's evolution would only last for about 15 minutes, and then he reluctantly got out of Snorlax's belly trap. The outline of his face seemed to have become soft, and the look in his eyes was also soft, as if he had been infected by the Snorlax factor. After Snorlax found that its owner had left, it finally couldn't help but sit down, and then lay down with its belly facing the sky, and started to snore. It actually fell asleep just like that. Didn't we agree to eat before going to sleep? Dake took the opportunity to check its meatball again, then he picked up the magic card and injected magic power into it to check its data. Card name, Snorlax. Type, Sprite card. Level, Race, Bird type. Attribute, Normal. Magic power, 4000. Attack, 2000. Defense, 2500. Ultimate skill, Pick Up, Sleep, Heavy Stomp, Earthquake. It's actually 1 star higher than Dream. A 6-star sprite, its level. It can make it Snorlax XX. Dake was slightly happy. Since at first, it was of a S. Had a S strength and level, success factor. When it's S's when it's SS's. Although 2,500 points of basic defense wasn't the best among 6-star Magic Guide fairies, it was still pretty good. Moreover, its magic power had reached a terrifying 4,000 points. That was the peak value that only an 8-star Magic Guide fairy should have. Unfortunately, after the little Snorlax evolved into a Snorlax, it lost the most important skill, power storing. As a result, its defense could no longer be increased by 1.5 times and could only be maintained at 2,500 points. Among the 4 sure kill skills, the first one was the symbol of greed, Pick Up. Dake heaved a sigh of relief when he kept Pick Up as his ultimate skill. Although power storing was very violent, Snorlax's core killer skill was still Pick Up, so it was indispensable. The second sure kill skill, Sleep, slightly made up for the lack of Bide. Sleep. Enter a state of sleep that lasts for 1 round after activation. Restores 1/3 of your mana every 10 seconds and heals all abnormal statuses. The sleep state has been shortened from the original 2 rounds to 1 round, and the mana is regenerated in stages, but it can still cure all abnormal statuses. Basically, Snorlax with Sleep is equivalent to having twice the amount of mana in a short period of time. In a Magic Guide duel, I can also let Snorlax hug the Magic Guide ball and use Sleep, adopting the strategy of retreating. Let me try and see how long the cooldown of Sleep is. It can't be too short, or else it will be too exaggerated. Dake thought for a moment, then he directly issued an order to Snorlax. Snorlax, use Sleep. Snorlax, you, ZZ Dake, Snorlax. Snorlax, you, ZZ Dake. Then the question was, how would Snorlax know whether to use sleep when it was sleeping? Would it let someone hit it with a clip to reduce its HP? Dake patted its head and whispered in its ear like a devil, sweet and sour fish fillet, crystal pork shoulder, sweet and sour pork ribs, braised pork, fish-flavored shredded pork, plum blossom meat slices. Crack. Snorlax seemed to be stimulated, it suddenly bounced, and its belly rose and fell like waves. But it didn't wake up. Therefore, Dake knew that it had indeed used sleep as a sure kill skill. After that, Dake continued to look at the third sure kill skill, Heavy Stomp. Dake had a very vague impression of this kind of skill that didn't have any signature. He injected mana into the magic guide card and looked at it carefully. Heavy Stomp. Stomp on the ground with force to form a circular shockwave to attack all the opponents around it, causing them to be dizzy. Heavy Stomp. Additional effect when used together with Earthquake, there is a probability of triggering Ground Crack. An ordinary sure kill skill that can cause dizziness in a large area? Dake's eyes lit up after he finished reading. In his current lineup, there were actually quite a number of magic guide elves that had single-target sure kill skills, although many of them had restrictions. But this seemed to be the first sure kill skill of group control. Moreover, group control skills were never too few, and this, Heavy Stomp, seemed to have an additional sure kill skill effect. When used together with Earthquake, there is a probability of triggering Ground Crack. What is Ground Crack? With a trace of doubt, Dake continued to look at the last sure kill skill, Earthquake. Earthquake causes the ground to tremble, creating a terrifying shockwave to attack all the opponents around it. Earthquake, additional effect when used together with Heavy Stomp, there is a probability of triggering Ground Crack. Snorlax was only an ordinary magic guide elf, and Heavy Stomp and Earthquake were sure kill skills of the ground element. Therefore, they couldn't enjoy the enhancement of their own attributes, causing the power of these two sure kill skills to be lacking to a certain extent. However, the power of Earthquake seemed to have been adjusted, and it could even be described as terrifying. But thinking about it carefully, a sure kill skill that could create an earthquake would definitely be powerful. And the additional effect of Earthquake. So what exactly is Ground Crack? Dake couldn't help but continue to pour magic power into the magic guide card. After a while, when he noticed that the cooldown of sleep was about to end, he finally found out the information about Ground Crack from the depths of the magic guide card. Then he felt terrible all over. Ground Crack causes the opponent to fall into the cracks of the ground and attack. If the attack hits, the opponent will be on the verge of death. Ground Crack will cause fixed damage equivalent to the opponent's current HP. As long as the opponent's skill immunity is not 100%, the attack can cause near death. If the user's level is lower than the opponent's, the skill will fail. A sure kill skill that looks very powerful, but is actually very powerful. But the coverage of the skill is a little low, and the hit rate doesn't seem to be very high. Dake imagined the scene when Ground Crack appeared. Snorlax, which had just woken up and wanted to have a big meal, suddenly found that the food on its plate had turned into stone. It still ate it. No, let's think about it another way. Snorlax, which had just eaten and wanted to sleep, was suddenly awakened by a noise, then turned over and continued to sleep equals. Snorlax, which had been hungry for a whole day, suddenly found that the little demon beast was eating alone. It immediately stood up angrily and used Heavy Stomp on the little demon beast. The resulting circular shockwave instantly hit the little demon beast, causing its brain to be concussed, and it felt dizzy. After that, Snorlax immediately used Earthquake. The power that seeped into the ground from its feet caused the ground to shake, creating an even more terrifying shockwave and sending the little demon beast flying. In the midst of a miserable scream, Ground Crack was triggered. While the ground was shaking, a terrifying crack suddenly appeared. It spread from Snorlax's feet all the way to the bottom of the little demon beast's body, and swallowed it. After that, that terrifying crack suddenly closed, squeezing the little demon beast into a meat patty, and then it was spat out by the crack. Snorlax happily jumped over, picked up the meat patty on the ground, and swallowed it. No, under normal circumstances, it should be because the ground crack had been swaying for too long, and after the little demon beast woke up, it immediately flapped its wings and flew away, escaping from the crack. Miss. Let's not talk about the hit rate first. The triggering probability of ground crack is also not very high. It is very likely to be similar to the defense ignoring probability of Holy Sword. Moreover, it can't be effective against a higher level magic guide elf. But for a lower level magic guide elf, even if Snorlax doesn't trigger the ground crack, it can still deal with it calmly. Therefore, it doesn't have much practical significance. Generally speaking, it is probably just a sure kill skill with more fashionable value than practical value. Snorlax's movement speed is not fast to begin with, and with this sure kill skill with extremely low triggering probability and hit rate, it is really meaningless. After confirming, Dake recorded down the cooldown time of Snorlax's sleep. In fact, 3 minutes was not a long cooldown time, but in a Magic Guide duel where every second mattered, it was basically difficult to use the second cooldown time. But if Snorlax could control sleep at will, perhaps it could use the method of sleeping for half a minute every 3 minutes to obtain the endurance to go out and play. That would be really stupid. Once he thought of that scene, Dake couldn't help but laugh. He turned his head and looked at Snorlax's snow-white belly. Suddenly, he chuckled and pounced on that belly. Phew! Generally speaking, although the Magic Guide refining this time was a little off, it was a good, wonderful, and excellent one. In fact, Dake still had 2 dragon worm fruits in his hands. One was a green apple and the other was a red apple, which could still be used to refine a fruit-gnawing worm. However, he only had 4 points of greed left in his reserve, and it was already the 10th day of July. There was only one chance left, and he wouldn't have the chance to get 7 points this month. Therefore, Dake prepared to save those 2 dragon worm fruits, and use them again in August. If all went well, he should be able to refine at least 1 fruit-gnawing worm from these 2 apple-shaped dragon worm fruits. Then, there was only one Magic Guide elf left in the plan to upgrade Paradise. For the last Magic Guide elf, Dake actually wanted to use the blood crystal of the water dragon lizard and the fruit of greed dragon to refine a water element dragon. However, until now, he still hadn't figured out which water element dragon was compatible with greed. If the Magus himself didn't have a relatively clear goal, the success rate of refining a Magic Guide elf would be very difficult to guarantee. Doc had always had a particularly high success rate when it came to refining Magic Guide fairies. It was because he had a clear goal almost every time he refined a Magic Guide elf. Moreover, in his heart, he had a relatively deep understanding of the Magic Guide elf that he wanted. About 15 minutes later, Snorlax degenerated back to Little Snorlax. Seeing that Little Snorlax had woken up from its degeneration and was lying down again, Dake said lightly, "Don't blame me for not reminding you, it's almost time to eat." Ka! Little Snorlax suddenly quivered, and its 2 triangular ears stood up. Then, it immediately stood up and followed behind Dake while biting its finger. Dake smiled, then he quickly cleaned up the remains of the experiment and recorded the results of the experiment. When everything was done, it was indeed close to the time to eat. However, the Magic Guide elves that were supposed to be out of school long ago still hadn't returned to their rooms. Did they keep me in class again? Looks like I need to give the tutors a raise. Dake laughed and walked toward the classroom with Little Snorlax. Although it was just born, learning didn't wait for anyone. Dake took it to meet the tutors while they were still working. Little Snorlax didn't know what kind of hell it was going to face, but it still followed behind Dake with a cute face, showing a greedy look while looking at the decorations in the corridor. Dake soon arrived at the tutor's office. There were 3 tutors in the office. They were Silent Sage Cyrus, Silver Wolf Knight Camilla, and Princess Tutor Cook. Dake looked at Ms. Cook with a surprised look and asked curiously, "Is Mr. Plant in charge of the last class today?" Ms. Cook nodded and said, "Mr. Plant missed class this morning, so he's going to make up for it in this last class." Doc nodded and stepped aside so that the appearance of Snorlax could be seen in the eyes of the tutors. "Is this the Magic Guide fairy you want to refine?" Cyrus' heart stirred, and he asked directly. Dake smiled embarrassedly and said, "I made a mistake." Then, he turned around and pushed little Snorlax to the front and said, "Come, everyone here will be your tutors from now on." Snorlax? Little Snorlax raised its head with a puzzled look. Dake had already started to introduce it. The tutors soon realized that this magic guide elf named Little Snorlax was a little lazy worm that didn't know anything. It has zero foundation now, so it can't go to class with other magic guide elves. Ms. Cook thought for a while and said, "But I can stay here at night and give it private tutoring. What do you think?" Dake frowned slightly and looked at Ms. Cook carefully. Suddenly, he had a suggestion in his mind. "How about this? I'll make a room for you in the Duke's mansion, and you can move in. That way, the students can ask you for help when they have problems at night." "Move to the Duke's mansion?" Ms. Cook didn't think much and nodded. "That's not impossible. I'm all alone, so it's not inconvenient." "Okay," Dake said with a relaxed frown. "Then, Little Snorlax will join your study group first. But if you wanted to study seriously, I'm afraid you'll have to solve the problem of excessive sleepiness first." "That's not difficult." Cyrus looked at Little Snorlax with great interest and said, "It just needs a little reagent to wake up the brain." "The second person who took drugs to school?" Dake lowered his head and touched Little Snorlax's head, feeling touched by its determination to learn. "Little Snorlax, Snorlax." When the last afternoon class of the magic guiding elves had finally ended, Dark brought Snorlax in front of Miss Plant so that she could familiarize herself with it. Then, he directly invited the tutors to have dinner with him. Probably because it was really late and the master of the Duke's mansion wasn't here, the tutors didn't refuse this time. Dake introduced Little Snorlax to the elves and asked Dilu to take care of it temporarily. Then, he sat at the table with the tutors and talked about the learning progress and the group test in the middle of the month while eating. Deanna and Aurora couldn't get a word in at this time. In the end, Deanna rolled her eyes and dragged Aurora to the table where the elves were eating, fighting for food with the little cuties. Deanna took a fancy to Little Snorlax at first glance. Then, she shamelessly squeezed to its side and kept feeding it. Little Snorlax's affection for her suddenly shot up like a rocket. Deanna's eyes curved like a crescent moon, getting closer and closer to it. Little Snorlax, who didn't know that its beauty was being targeted, was already dazzled by the delicious food on the table. While the atmosphere in the Duke's mansion was good because of the new family members, incidents were happening all over the King's city. Yvette and Claire didn't return to the mansion until late at night. Their eyes were filled with exhaustion. After extracting the last pride for this month, Dake started to write Mathematics 2. Time flew by quickly. 5000 plus 114/233. Next update night. Same time, monthly votes please. Chapter 503. After having the experience of writing Mathematics I, Dake was obviously more comfortable with writing Mathematics 2. It only took him 3 days to come up with the overall framework. All that was left was to fill in the gaps according to the framework. This was the most important part. Basically, Mathematics 2 was based on Mathematics I and introduced the concept of functions and relatively complicated geometric problems. After all, it was only a second-grade textbook, so Dake didn't add too much knowledge. He only kept the overall difficulty level within the scope of middle school knowledge and occasionally added some Olympiad questions. And most of the formulas and theorems used in it were, as usual, handed over to the greatest mathematician in history, anonymous. The entire writing process was relatively smooth. Dake divided mathematics into 2 major themes, namely calculation and geometry. He planned to continue to study these 2 themes in the future. The morning of the 14th of July. It was Saturday. Dake Dimming, who had just finished writing the framework of Mathematics 2, was ready to give himself a little break. Therefore, he only did a simple morning exercise and went to the dining hall in a relaxed manner. Remember 1 second. https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP. There were only 24 hours left until the Demon King's execution ceremony. Waves were surging everywhere in the King's city. Some of the forces hidden in the dark also revealed themselves. The entire King's city was filled with a stormy atmosphere. But no matter what happened outside, the Duke's mansion was still peaceful. Doc didn't have the slightest interest in participating. He just wanted to spend the weekend comfortably in this calm and peaceful Duke's mansion. If possible, he wanted to put a pot of black tea and some pastries on the table. He wanted to use some special means to watch a good show from afar. This world was full of mysteries. The explosive development of magical technology brought about changes to the world, but it also brought about unpredictable crises. According to the common sayings of the prophets, the disaster did not disappear and the world would eventually return to chaos. But no matter what era the prophets were in, that was what they said. From Dake's point of view, as long as he restrained himself, it would be his greatest contribution to the world. He was very clear on this point and had been doing this all this time. In his free time, it was naturally his right to occasionally eat some melons. The forces of the Duke's mansion had already begun to move quietly. Even the 12 maid squads, which were the private forces, had begun to take action. The Lion Palace Maid Group, led by Trina, and the Scorpio Palace Maid Group, led by Chris, were the two most active groups. However, the Lion Palace Maid Squad was active in the open while the Scorpio Palace Maid Squad was active in the dark. Dake sat down in the dining hall, and the head maid of the Ares Palace Maids, Olga, quietly came over. Ali was always there for him whenever he needed her. "How is it?" Dake asked. Olga put down the tray she was holding with one hand, picked up the milk tea she had just made, and moved it to the table. Only then did she smile. "I borrowed 2 people from Chris." Dake asked curiously, "Which 2 people?" Olga stretched out her index finger and twirled it in a circle. She smiled and said, "Young master should also have an impression of these 2 people. They are twins." Dake frowned and thought for a while. Suddenly he said, "Eve and Erin?" Olga nodded. "That's them. So they are still here?" Dake couldn't help but recall. Eve and Erin were a pair of twins. They were orphans that Yarvet brought back from the orphanage. Because they were close in age, they were originally trained as Dake's personal maids. But later on, Olga basically took care of all of Dake's daily needs, so Eve and Erin didn't seem necessary anymore. Dake didn't have a particularly good relationship with them. The main reason was that the 3 of them were close in age. Therefore, they were competitors in terms of basic education and etiquette. It wasn't easy for the 2 sisters to find someone who was willing to adopt them, so their diligence in their studies wasn't something that Dake could compare to. Therefore, when the 3 of them were compared, Dake was always the last. For a noble young master who was naturally arrogant, being suppressed by 2 commoners naturally wasn't a good feeling. Although Dake didn't do anything despicable, he didn't treat them well either. Perhaps this was one of the reasons why they disappeared from his side. But now, it seemed that they weren't sent out of the Duke's mansion. Instead, they were transferred to Chris's Scorpio Palace Maid Group, and were still working in the Duke's mansion. It was just that the maids of Scorpio Palace Maid Group didn't usually appear outside, so Dake never saw them again. "They should be 14 years old now, right?" Dake knocked on the table with his knuckles and asked slowly. If he remembered correctly, the 2 sisters were 1.5 years older than him. Now that his birthday had just passed, Eve and Erin should only be 14 years old. "Should be." Olga poured the steaming milk tea into a cup and moved it in front of Dake. Then she said, "As for the specific information, young master, it's better if you ask them yourself." Dake picked up the spoon and stirred the milk tea slightly. Then he said, "Bring over the newspapers for the past 2 days." "Yes, young master." Olga left immediately. Dake waited for the milk tea to cool down a little. Then, he took a small sip against the rim of the cup and revealed a trace of satisfaction. Olga was indeed very talented in this area. It only took her a few days to make a drinkable milk tea. It was just that the pearl of the milk tea didn't fit his taste. After he drank half of the milk tea, Olga came back with a stack of newspapers. Doc randomly picked out a copy and began to read it. During his time in the Duke's mansion, he still maintained the good habit of reading newspapers. Other than the Great Sage Daily, he would also read some more entertaining newspapers. One of them was called Clown Daily. Just like its name, the entire page was filled with hilarious entertainment reports. Sometimes, it would even make people burst out in laughter. For example, the analysis and evaluation of the Demon King execution ceremony. The Clown Daily went straight to the core and wrote in an extremely comical context, "No way, no way. You guys don't really believe that old guy Abel Yerkes can find a way to completely kill the Demon King, right? I think the Demon King must have escaped. That's why the Holy Church was so desperate to use the execution ceremony as a cover. Otherwise, normal people wouldn't even know where the Demon King was sealed. Why would they take the initiative to attack?" "What? You said that the Holy Church is on the 5th floor and deliberately deceiving the world to lure out the remnants of the demons? If you think so, then so be it. In short, it was very funny. How could the Demon King possibly escape from the seal, right?" Dake read the newspaper while savoring the situation outside. During this period of time, Yvette and Claire's names frequently appeared in various newspapers and periodicals. And in the Holy Church, there were also famous people like the Twin Holy Knights, who often appeared. In the Badia prison, the beds that had been vacated because of the Christmas escape seemed to be filled up again. The kingdom's bounty list had new breakthroughs every day. But those who couldn't hold back and showed up these days were in the minority. The real big forces were probably waiting for the arrival of the 15th of July. Regardless of whether the execution ceremony was real or not, those people had already been attracted. Now that the people had been attracted, it was up to the Holy Church to plan what to do next. Prince Charles was excluded from this incident. The princess faction led by the Valkyrie also didn't go deep into the core. Most of the other forces didn't dare to easily intervene. The king only ordered his subordinates to protect the capital. In the entire royal city, there were countless people watching the drama unfold. Just as the Holy Church preached, this was a moment to witness history. Regardless of whether they succeeded or not, this Demon King execution would be recorded in history. In order to witness this historic moment, not only in the capital, but also all over the world had come. Since the end of the war, the capital hadn't been so lively for a long time. Those subhumans who didn't easily set foot in the capital were also attracted. Among them, there must be some people who pretended to be fish eyes and had other purposes. The chaos caused by this made the princess, who took over the conflict between subhumans and humans, exhausted. As the saying went, those who are not of our race must have different intentions. Therefore, even the princess faction, who had a good impression of subhumans, wouldn't easily stand in the position of supporting other races. But during this time, she suddenly thought of a slogan that was enough to set up a banner. That was, "Subhumans are also humans." Physiologically, this was indeed a fact. After all, there was indeed no reproductive isolation between humans and subhumans. But because the differences in appearance exceeded the scope of skin color, hair color, and eye color, the gap between subhumans and humans gradually widened. Of course, the Princess Royal wasn't stupid enough to really raise the banner of "Subhumans are also humans." That would be standing on the opposite side of most humans. Therefore, she changed the slogan to "Mixed bloods are humans too." Because hybrids were only a small number of vulnerable groups, it was easy to gain more sympathy while supporting them. This kind of act of spreading her goodwill would also improve her image. At the same time, Prince Charles had also begun to move. As a war hawk, he needed to publicize the bad side of the subhumans. For example, the arrogance of the dwarves, the boorishness of the orcs, and the selfishness of the elves. Reporting the conflicts between subhumans and humans after entering the royal city without any embellishment was in itself a guide to public opinion. When people gradually realized that humans couldn't coexist with subhumans, the outbreak of war seemed logical. Taking advantage of the gust of wind of the Demon King execution ceremony, countless people started a game behind the scenes. "Young master." A crisp call woke Dake up from his thoughts. He turned to look at the door. The twins, Eve and Erin, had appeared silently. It was as though to make it easier for the sisters to be distinguished, or to make it harder for them to be distinguished when they exchanged identities. Eve and Erin were dressed in black and white maid outfits respectively. Their outfits were obviously modified. The hemline of the skirt was very short, and between the stockings, a section of their snow-white thighs was exposed. Dake sized them up and discovered that Eve and Erin were already 1.6 meters tall. As young girls who had just turned 14, they still had room for growth. However, their flat chests seemed to have given them a death sentence. Eve and Erin looked alike. Their black hair was neatly trimmed, and they had a single ponytail. There weren't any distinguishing marks on their faces, such as freckles. But Dake vaguely remembered that they should have a mole in a different location. Eve's was on the left, while Erin's was on the right. However, he couldn't remember exactly where the mole was. But since they were his maids, there wasn't a need to be concerned. Young Master Dimming, who was full of curiosity, asked casually, "By the way, where is your mole?" The two sisters, who were originally indifferent, immediately blushed. But as a result of being loyal to their master for a long time, even though their faces were flushed red, they endured the shame, gnashed their teeth, and said, "Tibbet, oh, so it's on your butt." Dake said calmly. It seemed like they had the experience of playing with water together when they were young. Then he beckoned to them. "You two, come here." Eve and Erin walked over with red faces. The two sisters were well-mannered, and it was apparent that they were the products of maid Gu Wei's education. Even though they were dressed simply and didn't put on any makeup, the tenderness of 14-year-old young ladies didn't need any external adornment. When the two sisters came closer, Dake extended his hands, one on the left and one on the right. Eve and Erin looked up at him and hesitated for a few moments as though they were trying to figure out his intentions. Then, they extended their hands at the same time and placed one on each of Dake's palms. After so many years, the palms of the three children met once again. Dake couldn't help but lament. "Time really flies. My palms are already bigger than yours." The two sisters knitted their brows and a faint glint flashed in their eyes. When they were first adopted, they were raised as Dake's personal maids. Later, they were eliminated for various reasons. Naturally, there was a gap between them. Dake looked up and said, "Tell me about how you've been all these years." Eve and Erin looked at each other. As the elder sister, Eve said, "Nothing much. We're just learning from head maid Chris." Dake asked, "Is it hard?" Eve shook her head. "How can it be hard when we're learning knowledge?" Dake retracted his hand and smiled. "Let me see what you've learned." The two sisters took a step back. Eve said, "Head maid Chris taught us the shadow stealth spell." "Shadow stealth?" Dake thought for a moment and said, "Is it the spell that allows one to travel in shadows?" Eve nodded. Dake couldn't help but say enviously, "So, you have that kind of talent?" "Actually, I've always wanted to know how it feels to sneak into shadows." Eve said, "It's not an overly special feeling. Because after entering a shadow, one's body will turn from three-dimensional to planar, which is why the interior of the seemingly thin shadow will be relatively spacious. We can't even detect the changes ourselves. For those with abilities, the shadow won't obstruct their vision. So, all in all, it's no different from diving into water. The only thing we need to worry about is our clothes." Eve lifted the hem of her skirt and twirled around. "Our clothes and weapons are made of special materials. Otherwise, we would be pushed out in the process of sneaking into the shadow. Fortunately, the magic cards are closely related to one's magical creations and can be carried around. But Eve and I aren't talented in magic technology and have only mastered a few types of magic cards. They are all half-finished products that Teacher Chris provided and refined." As she spoke, she revealed a bashful smile. When Erin saw her elder sister's shyness, her gaze turned cold. Unlike her elder sister who always paid attention to the young master, Erin would rather stay in the Scorpio Palace maid squad. The freedom of not needing to serve anyone was what she wanted. But being here, she certainly wouldn't show it. After Dake listened to Eve's explanation, he asked, "What about the consonant spell?" Eve nodded with a smile. "Of course, I've mastered it." She and Aaron had mastered 3 types of magic respectively. 2 of them were the shadow concealment spell and the consonant spell. Unlike the shadow concealment spell, which required a special talent, the consonant spell was a spell that required 2 people to cultivate together. It required a close blood relationship. If they were twins, it would be easier to master it. Using the consonant spell, one could instantly transmit what one saw and heard to the other party in the form of a spell from thousands of miles away. It was a special spell that was used during wartime to transmit messages from thousands of miles away. But it was a pity that there weren't many talents who could master the consonant spell. Those who weren't proficient in it had many limitations, which was why there was a serious lack of information during wartime. Both Eve and Aaron had the shadow concealment spell, and were proficient in the consonant spell. They could be considered rare talents. It would also be convenient for them to be personal maids. It was a pity that they met Olga, who received the recognition of the Ares battle suit at the age of 13. It could be said that they were unlucky. But as they grew older, Olga's temperament became gentler, which was why she transferred them back to Dake when he needed them. "Since you've mastered the consonant spell, there shouldn't be any problems." Dake smiled. This way, he could watch the Demon King execution ceremony as he wished without being present at the scene. "Therefore, I have to prepare the melon seeds, milk tea, and popcorn. Ready, go." After inviting the 2 sisters for breakfast, Dake got them to perform the consonant spell. Eve followed him while Aaron headed to the back of the mountain. Everything Aaron saw and heard was processed by Eve's brain and projected onto the snow-white wall. The resolution and number of frames of the projection were determined by their magical power output and control abilities. When the consonant spell was activated, the scene of a serene forest appeared on the wall. Then, the rustling of leaves and subtle cries of beasts sounded. The entire room seemed to have shifted to the dense forest at the back of the mountain all of a sudden, as though they were there. "Is this the consonant spell? I wonder if it can be converted into a spell card." Dake praised endlessly, which delighted Eve, who was one of the terminals. Then, the projection on the wall fluctuated all of a sudden. However, it wasn't Eve's side that had a problem. Instead, it was Aaron's side that was unstable. When the consonant spell was activated, not only were the voices and images synchronized, but the thoughts of the 2 sisters were also synchronized. Aaron was repulsed by the fact that her elder sister was happy because of such a small praise. But they were professionally trained, after all, and the fluctuation calmed down in an instant. Then, Aaron went deeper into the forest. On the other hand, Dake commanded her in high spirits as though they were on a cloud tour, which was entirely different from going up the mountain personally. "This is awesome," he praised incessantly. After 15 minutes, he calmed down and asked Eve, "Sister Eve, with your magical powers, how long can the consonant spell last?" Eve replied without hesitation, "If we go all out, it can last for half an hour. If we pay the price of lowering the clarity, it can last for a whole day. Of course, we brought along mana recovery potions, so it can last longer under normal circumstances." "Mana recovery potions?" Dake pondered for a few moments before retrieving a bottle filled with jelly beans from his pocket and tossing it to her. "Have a taste. If you like it, I'll get Ali to make a few more jars." Eve received the jelly beans and poured one into her mouth. The sweetness with a tinge of sourness flowed into her heart and made her swallow her saliva. Eve smiled. "I'm fine with sweets, but my younger sister loves them." Dake nodded. "Then bring more tomorrow." Another half an hour passed. Dake reluctantly stopped the sisters from casting the spell. The advantage of having 2 terminals was that Eve could stabilize the images transmitted by Aaron and prevent the images from shaking violently due to Aaron's vigorous movements. He said, "That's all for today. We'll prepare a big screen tomorrow. The clarity doesn't have to be too high, just 4K will do." Eve asked dubiously, "What's 4K?" Dake replied, "Ultra high definition." Even though it was a Saturday, however, since the in-phase test was tomorrow, the other 3 professors were all in the Duke's mansion except for the Silver Wolf Knight Camilla. Dake had ordered his men to prepare temporary lodging rooms for Silent Sage Cyrus and former Royal Botanical Garden Director Plant. Both of them would be staying in the Duke's mansion with Madam Cook until the end of the test tomorrow. The main reason wasn't to prepare for the test. Instead, it was because the King City wasn't safe today and tomorrow, especially tonight. Even though Cyrus and Madam Plant were powerful beings, they were old, after all, and didn't like to fight. In order to prevent any accidents, Dake made them stay. As for Silver Wolf Knight Camilla, she stayed in the Garrett Bayer family. Even Anna was prohibited from leaving the house. The entire King City was filled with an intense atmosphere as though a storm was about to come. The situation was equally tragic for Dake's magic elves. Because tomorrow was the in-phase test, the results of their learning so far would be completely revealed as the in-phase test progressed. If anyone did badly, they would undoubtedly be hung on the execution pillar. Even if they didn't lose the little red flower, they would still have to bear the ridicule and mockery of the other magic elves. Even though Dake's magic elves didn't show it on the surface, the internal competition was very fierce. They were always good at maintaining the image of an obedient baby in front of their master, but when their master turned around, they would show their fangs. The competition between Dryway Beast and Fairy Ibu was especially fierce. In the last final test, Dryway Beast was ranked first, and Fairy Ibu was ranked second. This time, Fairy Ibu had a ribbon on her head and was determined to be first. Dryway Beast didn't slack off either. Even though it looked calm on the surface, it stayed up all night to study. The rest of the magic elves didn't lose out either. In Dake's bedroom, there would be candlelight shining every night. Therefore, on Saturday, the magic elves were doing their final sprint before the test. Only Snorlax was lying on the balcony, snoring non-stop. Seeing that Snorlax was so lazy, Trash Slime, whose intelligence had increased slightly with Ms. Plant's help, seemed to have seen a chance to get rid of its last place status. These days, it had been studying by candlelight all night. Even Trash Slime was working so hard. What qualifications did the other magic elves have to not work hard? Everyone seemed to have realized a terrifying fact: if Trash Slime caught up with them, they would really be worse than trash. Dake saw this and was happy in his heart. He was only preparing to hold a grand announcement of the results after their test ended. That way, the top student would have a greater sense of accomplishment, right? In order to provide an environment for the magic elves to study at ease, he specially didn't return to his room for the whole day. That afternoon, he invited Olga and brought Eve and Erin to the kitchen. Dake didn't have too many thoughts. He only wanted to make all kinds of milk tea, cold drinks, shaved ice, and ice cream to satisfy the oral desire. July was hot, but the summer heat was even more intense. This year's summer might not end until September. The research and development process went smoothly. Olga's culinary skills were second to none. Dake's eagle hand was fast and steady. Eve's and Erin's fingers were also nimble. Without any hindrance, the samples were produced one after another. Dake even tried to make double-skim milk and it tasted great. While Dake Dimeng was immersed in the kitchen, the chaos in the King's City intensified. Until today, there were still a large number of outsiders entering the King's City. The city guards didn't close the city gates. Instead, they raised the inspection threshold. However, there were plenty of ways for demons and monsters to sneak into the city. At noon, when the sun was scorching, the airflow at the top of the sentry tower was slightly distorted. A fairy with butterfly wings sat on the top of the sentry tower like a cloud of air. Even the wyverns and griffins hovering in the sky didn't notice her presence. When Didi Makesy Way appeared again, she had restored her youthful and beautiful face. Something as interesting as the Demon King execution ceremony was, of course, a little fairy who wished for the world to be in chaos would be involved. After being locked up for half a year, the little fairy finally slipped out. She greedily sucked in the fresh air, thinking that she wouldn't meet those annoying fellows in the King's City that was so far away, right? Suddenly, she focused her gaze and noticed a giant beast galloping toward her from afar. She watched as the giant beast waved its 6 chubby short legs and galloped toward the city gate. Didi quickly flapped her wings and shrunk her body. In the blink of an eye, she turned into a black-winged butterfly and hid behind the sentry tower. Lily Laplace, who was standing on the 6-legged giant beast and shouting excitedly, suddenly paused. She lifted her head and looked at the sentry tower. Her beautiful eyes flickered with doubt. The butterfly that Didi had transformed into hurriedly stopped flapping its wings for fear of being caught on the spot by Lily. Damn it, why did Lily come to the king's city? However, in addition to Lily, Ka Zaire and Sarah Shi Erfu were also on the 6-legged giant beast. She didn't want to see them. This trio had actually come to the king's city at such a special time. Lili, who did you see? Professor Shi Erfu noticed Lili's strange behavior and immediately asked. Lili shook her head and then smiled. Just a butterfly. Professor Shi Erfu smiled and turned to the city gate. We finally arrived before the 15th. Should we find a hotel first, or directly inquire about the location of the ceremony? Professor Ka Zaire twirled his wand and said humorously, Then let's go to the hotel and inquire about the location of the ceremony. Lili was surprised. Are we going to find a hotel? Isn't Little Dake's home in the king's city? Professor Shi Erfu rolled his eyes at her and said, We are here to play, not to visit your home. Professor Ka Zaire also smiled. Although Dimming will definitely welcome us, we can't just go to a student's home and stay there, right? I suggest that we wait until tomorrow's execution ceremony is over before visiting the Duke's mansion. All right. Lily pursed her lips and grumbled, But what kind of ceremony is this? Is it that interesting? Professor Shi Erfu and Professor Ka Zaire looked at each other but didn't answer. Among the three, only Lily didn't know that the Demon King had escaped. Plus, she wasn't interested in the Demon King, so she naturally felt bored. However, for people like Professor Shi Erfu and Professor Ka Zaire who knew about it, it was very meaningful. Both of them wanted to see what kind of trouble the Holy Church would cause. The three above, the city guard in charge of checking the identity of the people entering the city raised his head and shouted. The 6-legged beast with the head of a toad stared at him as he approached. From time to time, its tongue would stick out from its mouth, giving people a terrifying feeling that it would suddenly pop out and suck them into its mouth. Professor Shi Erfu said softly to the people below, Wait a moment, we'll come down. After saying that, she waved her hand and 2 gusts of wind blew over, bringing the 3 of them to the ground. As for the 6-legged beast, it dissipated into magic power after the 3 of them came down. It was Professor Ka Zaire's magic elf. They originally came on a flying magic elf, but Lily insisted on seeing the scenery along the way, so they changed to a ground-type beast. Seeing the 3 of them cooperate, the city guard couldn't help but sigh in relief. The 6-legged beast's aura was so strong that he almost asked for backup. Fortunately, the magus controlling the beast was the reasonable type. But this combination, the city guard's eyelids twitched. Elf, goblin, gremlin? He didn't dare to show his surprise. He just asked Professor Shi Erfu and the other 2 to show their identity cards. As professors of the Shang Malian Academy, Professor Shi Erfu and the other 2 naturally had identity cards issued by the kingdom. They showed them one by one. The city guard put the identity cards into a magic device. After the device's green button lit up, he returned the identity cards and warned them, After entering the city, please be careful not to summon any beasts. Also, the environment in the city is chaotic recently, so it's not suitable for you to go out. You'd better find a hotel to stay in as soon as possible. Let them in. Professor Shi Erfu nodded slightly and pulled Li and Professor Ka Zaire into the city. The combination of these 3 people should be very eye-catching, but there was no lack of demi-humans who came to the capital recently. Even the elves came to visit in groups, not to mention the noisy orcs. Therefore, they were quickly drowned in the crowd. When they finally left, Didi Makesy Wei changed back. She sat in the air, swinging her 2 slender stocking legs. The red dancing shoes on her feet shone like gems. Unfortunately, No one could see them in the invisible state. So annoying. Didi pouted and looked at the ground with her eyes wide open. She had been looking at the door for a long time. She didn't have any special purpose. She just wanted to see who would come and get involved in this mess. The appearance of the Shang Malian trio was completely unexpected. She originally thought that the professors of the Shang Malian Academy would avoid such a ceremony hosted by the Holy Church. After all, the Holy Church was famous in history for being fond of shifting the blame. It could be said that it had formed a culture of shifting the blame. If the Shang Malian Academy, well, the principal had to be here. They would definitely shift the blame to a RTI for the failure of the ceremony. Although Didi Maxi Wei didn't know what happened to the Demon King, she was very sure that the Demon King couldn't be killed by some execution ceremony. In other words, she thought from the beginning that this Demon King execution ceremony would definitely fail. So she came all the way here just to see the Holy Church make a fool of themselves. I really want to know what the Holy Church will be like after the ceremony fails. Will they be angry? Or will they pretend to ignore it? Or will they desperately shift the blame? Will those guys who came to watch the show become the punching bags of the Holy Church? Or will the Holy Church use this as an excuse to whitewash this failed ceremony as a trap to attract the remnants of the demon race and the heretic church? Didi flapped her wings nonchalantly. Suddenly, she blinked and raised her head to look into the distance. In the sky far away, where humans couldn't see at all, there was a huge monster flapping its wings and flying over. It's a dragon. Even Didi Maxi Wei couldn't help but show a look of astonishment at this time. In this era, pure-blooded dragons were an extremely rare species that was almost extinct. The main reason was that pure-blooded dragons were naturally strong, but they were very easy to demonize. And under normal circumstances, demonized dragons were even stronger than before. This made the demon race very covetous of the pure-blooded dragons. At the end of the war, the demon race attacked the nests of the pure-blooded dragons more than once in order to increase their combat power by any means necessary. Famous places like the Dragon Valley and Divine Dragon Island were all trampled by the flames of war. A large number of pure-blooded dragons were demonized and corrupted. In order to take revenge, the pure-blooded dragons brazenly joined the 100 Races Alliance, and then lost many of their lives in the war. There were not many pure-blooded dragons to begin with, but now they were on the verge of extinction. Now that the war was over, the remaining pure-blooded dragons chose to live in seclusion and focused on researching breeding methods. Therefore, it was basically impossible to see a pure-blooded dragon outside. But with the little fairy's excellent perception, Didi recognized the pure-blooded dragon at a glance. And the other party had obviously seen her. Even though her invisibility skills were very high, it was still not enough in front of the true dragon's eye. Tisk. Didi clicked her tongue hard, then suddenly turned around and slipped away. And the pure-blooded dragon was rapidly descending in the distance. When it landed, it rapidly shrank. The girl sitting on it lightly jumped down and turned to look at the pure-blooded dragon that was turning into a human. And then the pure-blooded dragon turned into a human. It was obviously a white dragon. After turning into a human, it was also a silver-haired beauty with snow-white skin. Mom. The girl called out to the person that the white dragon had turned into. Yes. The silver-haired beauty nodded with a smile, as if she would never get tired of hearing that call. But the girl raised her slender finger and said, I'll enter the city alone. Mom, you can think of a way yourself. Huh? The silver-haired beauty was stunned and showed an aggrieved expression. The girl carefully tidied up her long black hair, which was completely different from her mother's, and said, I have an ID card. Let's meet again after entering the city. The silver-haired beauty nodded and said, Then it's decided. But Mom won't accompany you to watch the execution ceremony of the Demon King. I have to stay away from the people of the church. The girl shook her head and said, Didn't I say it before? We have a good place in the royal capital that the Saint Church can't touch. Although it's a little rude, but for Mom's safety, let's go visit that place tonight. The silver-haired beauty hesitated and said, Of course I remember. I remember every word you said. But is that place really reliable? I mean, you're just students of the same school. The girl picked up the little chubby dragon that was lying on her shoulder and swung it at her mother, and said meaningfully, "What do you think?" The silver-haired beauty looked at the intelligent magic elf and couldn't help but take a deep breath, and said, "Forget it, do as you wish." 5 in 1 10,000 plus, 0117/233. Friends in the college entrance exam, come on, come on, come on. PY should have been published at 12 o'clock last night, sorry woo-woo. Kavenga really had something to do and was delayed. That's the problem with the serial update. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.